My father, William Stanford, told every major architecture firm in the state that I was a thief for 4 excruciating years. The heavy glass doors of my profession were slammed shut, forcing me to scrub greasy tables and pour endless cups of black coffee just to survive. He thought poverty would break my spirit. He fully expected me to come crawling back to his sprawling luxury estate, begging for an unpaid filing job under my spoiled younger sister, Valerie. He was completely wrong. Last week, I sat in the sprawling glass boardroom of Vanguard Municipal Holdings for a finalist interview. The billionaire chief executive officer, a woman who terrified grown men with a single glance, studied my faded consignment blazer for a long, suffocating moment. Then, she reached into her dark leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy parchment envelope sealed with deep red wax. It was the exact envelope my late grandfather had prepared 10 years ago, as the brittle wax cracked open, exposing the undeniable proof of my father's decades of fraud. The entire room went dead silent. Before I reveal exactly what happened in that boardroom, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members who tried to hold you back. The pristine silence of that glass boardroom felt like a distant universe compared to the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of Ruby's diner. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon on a rainy Tuesday, and the heavy scent of old bacon grease and burnt coffee grounds clung to my hair. I dragged a damp, bleach-soaked rag across the cracked red vinyl of booth 4, pressing hard to remove a stubborn smear of dried syrup left over from the lunch rush. My shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb. I shifted my weight, pressing my heels into the thick Geel insoles hidden inside my scuffed black work shoes. Service industry work strips away your ego faster than a sandblaster against old paint. Here, nobody cared that I held a degree in urban landscape architecture. Nobody knew that I had graduated at the top of my class. To the tired truck drivers and exhausted night shift nurses filing into the diner, I was just Josephine, the quiet 27-year-old girl who kept their heavy ceramic coffee mugs full. Ruby, the owner of the diner, slapped a thick stack of clean plates onto the metal counter. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, observant eyes and hands weathered by decades of hard labor. She wiped her hands on her canvasy apron and slid a fresh pot of coffee toward me. She never asked about my past. When I walked into her diner 4 years ago, shivering in the bitter winter rain with a resume full of prestigious academic accolades and a bank account holding exactly $14, she just handed me a mop. I grabbed the coffee pot, my knuckles turning white around the black plastic handle. I survived on minimum wage and sparse tips, but my mind never stopped working. Hidden deep inside the oversized pocket of my stained apron was a small, worn leather notebook. It was my lifeline. Every time I had a spare 3 minutes between taking orders and scrubbing dishes, I pulled it out. I sketched intricate load-bearing retaining walls, mapped out subterranean water mains, and drafted sustainable urban waterfronts. I was meticulously planning my return to the industry my father had violently ejected me from. The small brass bell above the diner's front door chimed sharply. Cutting through the low hum of the ceiling fans, the heavy wooden door swung open, and the freezing rain blew inside, carrying a cloud of expensive, cloying floral perfume. I did not need to turn around to know who had just walked in. My younger sister, Valerie, stood in the entryway. She was 24 years old, draped in a pristine white cashmere coat that cost more than my entire annual rent. Flanking her were 3 of her closest friends, wearing tailored designer suits and carrying imported leather handbags. They looked completely out of place against the peeling linoleum and faded Formica countertops. Valerie scanned the narrow room, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her expensive smartphone. Her eyes locked onto my stained canvas apron, and a slow, malicious smirk spread across her face. She did not choose one of the 5 empty booths near the front. She marched her entourage directly toward the back corner, sliding into booth 6, the exact section I was assigned to cover. Her friends wrinkled their noses in obvious disgust, carefully wiping the seats with napkins before sitting down. Valerie leaned back, crossing her legs, and snapped her fingers in the air, pointing demandingly at the table. I did not flinch. I did not sigh or drop my gaze. I picked up a plastic menu, grabbed my order pad, and walked over to their booth with slow, measured steps. Just 4 black coffees," Valerie ordered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Make sure the mugs are actually clean. Josephine, we know how you struggle with basic tasks." Her friends let out a synchronized, mocking giggle. I kept my face entirely blank. I nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked to the service station. I poured 4 steaming cups of black coffee, placed them perfectly onto a circular serving tray, and returned to the booth. I set the first 3 mugs down without a single tremor in my wrist. As I reached forward to place Valerie's mug in front of her, she shifted her weight. She raised her hand, pretending to gesture to her friend, and intentionally struck the bottom of the heavy ceramic mug. The scalding black liquid erupted outward. It splashed across the table, dripping down the edge and hitting the front of my canvas apron. The burning heat soaked instantly through the thin fabric, searing the skin of my stomach. Worse than the physical pain, the dark liquid pooled rapidly across the table, flowing directly toward the worn leather notebook I had just placed down to take their order. The thick coffee soaked into the edges of the pages, bleeding dark brown stains across the complex, meticulous architectural sketches I had spent weeks drafting in the shadows. Valerie covered her mouth, feigning a gasp. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with vicious, unadulterated delight. "I guess you will just have to clean that up, won't you? After all, that is all you are good for now." Her friends leaned in, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to shatter. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw the remaining coffee in her face, or to run out of the diner in profound humiliation. They wanted a chaotic, emotional breakdown that would validate their manufactured superiority. I did not give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I stood perfectly still, ignoring the stinging burn on my skin. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my damp, bleach-soaked rag. I picked up my ruined leather notebook, shaking the excess liquid off the pages with a slow, deliberate motion, and placed it safely onto my serving tray. Then, I leaned forward and wiped the table. My movements were clinical, precise, and utterly devoid of any human emotion. I cleared the mess in 5 seconds flat. I pulled a receipt pad from my pocket, scribbled the total amount for 4 coffees, and tore the slip of paper loose. I placed the bill squarely in front of Valerie. I wiped her spilled coffee from the cracked vinyl, my face a mask of stone. Knowing my silence infuriated her far more than a scream ever could. The label of thief was not born from a missing bank deposit, but from a desperate man's need to secure his golden child's future. As Valerie and her entourage strutted out of the diner, their mocking laughter bleeding into the chime of the brass bell, I stared at the dark coffee soaking into my canvas apron, the searing heat against my skin barely registered. Her final venomous parting words echoed in the cramped space, violently dragging my mind back to the exact moment my entire life was forcibly derailed. A seamless thread of memory pulled me 4 years into the past, returning me to the sprawling luxury estate I once called home. I was 23 years old, enduring the final, grueling semester of my graduate program in urban landscape architecture. My senior thesis required intense, hyper-complex 3-dimensional structural rendering, and my battered second-hand laptop had finally burned out, its internal fan emitting a high-pitched mechanical screech before the screen went permanently black, with my final deadlines looming. I walked down the grand corridor to my father's home office. I stood quietly just inside the threshold until William acknowledged my presence. He barely lifted his chin from his quarterly financial reports. When I explained the catastrophic hardware failure, he simply reached into his tailored suit jacket, withdrew his silver corporate credit card, and slid the heavy metal across the polished mahogany desk. He explicitly instructed me to purchase whatever technical equipment I needed to secure my degree, emphasizing that a Stanford did not accept academic failure. I walked into a specialized electronics retailer that afternoon and purchased a high-performance drafting tablet for exactly $4,000. I kept the original physical receipt, forwarded the digital copy directly to his corporate accountant, and received a standard confirmation email the following morning. The transaction was meticulously documented and entirely transparent. I spent the next 3 months hunched over that glowing screen until my vision blurred, pouring my soul into the complex municipal landscapes that would eventually earn me my summa cum laude distinction. I earned every single pixel on that device through raw, blistering, sleep-deprived effort. Valerie was 20 years old at the time, coasting her way through a generic university design program heavily subsidized by our father's massive annual endowment checks. She possessed absolutely zero technical skill, no creative vision, and a work ethic entirely dependent on the labor of others. One Tuesday evening, she pushed my bedroom door open without bothering to knock. She wore a pristine white designer dress, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against a small silver flash drive. She marched across my carpet and dropped the metal device directly onto my keyboard, intentionally disrupting my workflow. She had a final senior portfolio due by the end of the week. She desperately needed the submission to be flawless to justify the senior design title William was already holding for her at his commercial development firm. She did not ask for my help. She demanded my manual labor. She instructed me to generate 5 original structural designs and map them to her specific grading rubric, demanding I put her name on the title blocks. I looked at the silver flash drive resting on my desk. I reached out, picked the small metal casing up, held it out to her, and maintained an absolute suffocating silence. I did not argue. I did not attempt to explain academic integrity or basic morality. I simply refused to be her ghostwriter. Her manufactured, arrogant smile vanished instantly. The facade dropped, and her face twisted into a mask of ugly, spoiled fury. She snatched the drive from my open palm, her fingernails scraping sharply against my skin, and stomped heavily down the hallway. Her expensive heels echoed against the hardwood floor with the undeniable promise of immediate retaliation. That retaliation arrived exactly 24 hours later. The estate housekeeper knocked nervously on my bedroom door, her eyes fixed on her shoes as she informed me that my father required my immediate presence in his primary office. I walked down the sweeping, grand staircase, my stomach tightening with a cold, creeping dread, and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the west wing. The room smelled oppressively of expensive leather upholstery, aged bourbon, and burning cigar smoke. William sat behind his massive desk, slowly swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. The ice clinked sharply against the thick glass sides, the rhythmic metallic sound slicing through the tense, suffocating space. To his right sat my mother, Evelyn. She wore a tailored beige suit and a heavy strand of perfect, round pearls resting flush against her collarbone. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfectly rigid, her eyes fixed entirely on the intricate geometric patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet. She looked like a highly expensive, completely hollow porcelain doll. William stopped swirling his drink. He picked up a crisp, printed corporate credit card statement and slid it across the polished wood of his desk. He had circled the $4,000 charge for my drafting tablet in thick, bleeding red ink. He looked at me, his eyes entirely devoid of any paternal warmth, and stated that the charge was completely unauthorized. I stood perfectly still in the center of the expansive room. I kept my voice meticulously level, calmly reminding him of our previous conversation. I mentioned the physical receipt, the accountant's digital confirmation, and his explicit verbal approval from 3 months prior. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers together beneath his chin, and delivered a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He claimed he had authorized educational expenses exclusively for a loyal, cooperative member of the Stanford family, because I had selfishly refused to assist my younger sister with her pressing academic needs. I had severed the unspoken contract of family loyalty. Therefore, he decided, the company funds I used were retroactively deemed unauthorized. He looked me dead in the eye, his lip curling into a sneer, and branded me a thief. He accused me of brazen corporate embezzlement. He let the heavy, ugly accusation hang in the stale air, letting the threat of legal destruction marinate. Then, he offered his generous solution. He magnanimously stated he would not involve the authorities or press formal charges, sparing me from a devastating criminal record. Instead, I owed him a massive, compounding debt. To repay the $4,000, he demanded I sign a binding non-disclosure agreement and a contract to work as Valerie's personal assistant at Stanford and Associates for the next 5 years. I would receive absolutely no salary, no health benefits, and zero public credit. I would draft all her complex blueprints, correct her endless structural mistakes, and stand silently in the shadows while she accepted the industry accolades, the massive client bonuses, and the fawning praise of his wealthy peers. He was not asking for financial repayment. He was demanding indentured servitude to artificially inflate his golden child's non-existent career. I shifted my gaze to my mother. I waited for her to speak up, to defend the truth, to protect her eldest daughter from a blatant, crushing extortion attempt. Evelyn slowly raised her right hand, adjusted the heavy pearls resting against her neck, and finally looked at me. "Just apologize and do as your father says." "Josephine," she whispered, her voice a flat, monotone whisper entirely devoid of any genuine maternal emotion. "Do not be difficult. Family protects family." She was entirely complicit. She was perfectly willing to trade her eldest daughter's dignity to guarantee the absolute security of her country club luncheons, her designer wardrobes, and her luxury vehicles. She chose her comfort over my humanity. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or waste my precious breath defending myself to a man who had already written my sentence. I calmly slipped the strap of my canvas backpack off my shoulder, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out the sleek, black drafting tablet. I stepped forward and placed the heavy device gently, directly over the printed credit card statement on his desk. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the estate, and set it softly on top of the dark screen. William's smug, controlling expression shattered instantly. The thick veins in his neck bulged violently against his expensive silk collar. He slammed his closed fist against the mahogany wood, the crystal glass rattling dangerously close to the edge, and promised to scorch the earth. He swore, spit flying from his lips, that he would make sure no architecture firm in the entire state would ever hire a thief. I turned my back on his red-faced, spitting fury and walked out of the room. As the heavy oak doors of my childhood home slammed shut behind me, I realized my father didn't just want his money back, he wanted my absolute, unconditional surrender. Arrogance cannot tolerate defiance, and my father's patience with my survival had officially expired. Valerie's failure to extract a chaotic, weeping breakdown from me at Booth 6 was not just a defeat for her, it was an unacceptable failure for William Stanford. When the spoiled golden child returned to the sprawling luxury estate with nothing but a torn receipt and a story of my impenetrable silence, my father inevitably decided to escalate the siege. He refused to let me exist in peace. If poverty had not broken my spine over the past 4 years, he would simply dismantle the very floor I stood on. The strike occurred 24 hours later, precisely at 11 in the morning on Wednesday. The diner hummed with the steady clatter of silverware and the low murmur of the mid-morning regulars. I was balancing a heavy serving tray loaded with 3 plates of scrambled eggs and hash browns when the brass bell above the entryway chimed. A man stepped through the door, his presence abruptly lowering the temperature in the room. He did not wear faded denim or scuffed work boots. He wore a pristine, charcoal gray, bespoke suit. A silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat and carried a slim, black leather briefcase. He surveyed the peeling linoleum floor and the cracked vinyl booths with undisguised revulsion. He was a corporate attack dog. I recognized the predatory, confident posture instantly. He bypassed the host stand, completely ignoring the waiting customers, and marched directly toward the open kitchen pass. Ruby stood behind the hot, flat-top grill, pressing a thick metal spatula down on a sizzling row of burger patties. She did not look up when the lawyer stopped on the opposite side of the metal counter. He unclasped his briefcase, the metal lock snapping sharply. He withdrew a thick, legal-sized manila folder and dropped it onto the aluminum surface, narrowly missing a puddle of spilled ketchup. He did not introduce himself. He leaned forward, resting his manicured hands on the counter, and began reciting a meticulously fabricated list of municipal violations. He cited obscure grease trap disposal ordinances. He referenced outdated parking proximity mandates and threatened sudden, severe health department inspections that would trigger immediate operational suspensions. His voice was a low, measured hum, deliberately designed to intimidate without drawing the attention of the surrounding patrons. He painted a picture of absolute, devastating bureaucratic ruin. Then, he offered his singular, extortionate compromise. He tapped a single manicured finger against the manila folder. The entire barrage of municipal citations and sudden inspections would completely vanish, he promised. If Ruby terminated my employment immediately, he explicitly demanded she throw me out onto the street and permanently bar me from the premises. I stood frozen near booth 2, the heavy serving tray digging painfully into my palm. My chest tightened. My father was no longer waiting for me to starve. He was actively coordinating my eviction from my final sanctuary. He was leveraging his massive commercial development influence to crush a small, independent business owner simply to sever my lifeline. Ruby did not gasp. She did not tremble. Nor did she look at the legal documents resting on her counter. She scraped the edge of her heavy metal spatula against the griddle. Pushing away a layer of burnt grease, she wiped the hot metal blade with a thick, damp towel. Then, Ruby reached across the pass. She picked up the thick manila folder, her grease-stained fingers leaving dark smudges across the pristine paper. Without breaking eye contact with the corporate lawyer, she dropped the entire legal threat directly into a nearby plastic trash bin overflowing with cracked eggshells, wet coffee grounds, and discarded napkins. "We only serve paying customers here," Ruby stated, her voice a deep, gravelly rumble entirely devoid of fear. She pointed the tip of her metal spatula directly toward the heavy wooden exit door. "Buy a cup of coffee or get off my floor." The lawyer's confident, predatory smirk instantly evaporated. His jaw clenched tightly, the muscles fluttering beneath his clean-shaven cheeks. He opened his mouth, prepared to issue another threat. But Ruby stepped forward, raising a heavy cast-iron skillet from the back burner. The sheer, unbothered physical threat in her posture shut his mouth. He snapped his empty briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and marched out of the diner, the heavy door slamming aggressively behind him. Ruby turned back to the grill. She caught my eye through the rising smoke, gave a single, dismissive nod, and flipped a burger patty. She did not ask for an explanation, and she did not demand an apology for the immense danger I had brought to her doorstep. Her silent loyalty formed a heavy lump in my throat, solidifying my absolute resolve to obliterate my father's empire. That evening, the true, punishing cost of my defiance settled deep into my bones. I unlocked the door to my freezing, 300-square-foot apartment. The relentless, mechanical vibration from the 24-hour laundromat below rattled the cheap floorboards beneath my feet. I dropped my canvas backpack onto the floor and collapsed onto the edge of my narrow mattress. I reached down with stiff, trembling fingers and untied the laces of my scuffed work shoes. As I pulled my thick cotton socks off, the raw, blistering reality of the diner revealed itself. The skin on my heels and the balls of my feet was peeled and weeping, irritated by 9 hours of continuous, grueling physical labor. My lower spine throbbed with a dull, agonizing heat. I did not cry. I retrieved a cheap plastic basin, filled it with freezing water from the bathroom sink, and submerged my aching feet. The icy shock bit deeply into my skin. I gritted my teeth, gripping the edges of the mattress until my knuckles turned stark white. After 10 minutes, I dried my feet with a coarse towel, applied a generic antiseptic cream that stung like a swarm of hornets, and wrapped my heels in tight, fresh white medical gauze. I pulled on 2 layers of thick woolen sweaters to combat the biting draft seeping through the poorly insulated windows. When the digital clock on my bedside table flashed exactly 11 at night, I abandoned the physical pain. I limped over to a small, unsteady folding table and opened my refurbished, second-hand laptop. The cooling fan whirred into a loud, protesting, mechanical scream. But the screen flared to life, casting a pale blue light across my tired face, from 11 at night until 3 in the morning. The exhausted waitress ceased to exist. I opened my encrypted architectural software. I was actively designing a massive, fully integrated municipal waterfront park. It was an aggressive, hyper-complex urban development model intended for the Vanguard Municipal Holdings national competition. I pushed the searing pain in my feet and the exhaustion in my spine completely out of my mind. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I executed intricate, highly complex structural physics calculations. I designed subterranean flood mitigation barriers utilizing porous, eco-friendly concrete specifically engineered to absorb massive coastal storm surges. I drafted tiered, load-bearing retaining walls cleverly disguised as sprawling community botanical gardens. I calculated the precise wind shear tolerance across 3 proposed pedestrian suspension bridges, adjusting the steel tension ratios until the mathematics balanced perfectly. I integrated advanced phytoremediation zones designed to naturally pull dangerous industrial toxins from the surrounding coastal soil. My father built generic, heavily paved commercial plazas that prioritized maximum corporate density over human utility and environmental integrity. I was building a sustainable masterpiece that fundamentally outclassed his entire lifetime portfolio. I manipulated the digital vectors, adjusting the structural load calculations and rendering the 3-dimensional sun paths until my vision blurred and my eyes burned fiercely. I forced my heavy eyelids open, pinched the bridge of my nose, and clicked the mouse again. I checked my encrypted proxy servers, ensuring my digital footprint remained entirely untraceable. When the clock finally struck 3 in the morning, I saved my massive files. My wrists ached from the repetitive strain, and my lungs felt heavy with exhaustion. I had exactly 1 hour to sleep before my alarm would drag me back to the griddle. Every digital line I rendered in the freezing dark of my apartment was a silent, heavy brick laid in the foundation of my inevitable return. The glowing screen of my phone illuminated a level of generational theft so brazen it made my stomach physically turn. It was precisely 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I sat on an overturned plastic milk crate in the narrow, damp alleyway behind Ruby's Diner, taking my single 15-minute break of the shift. The freezing coastal rain tapped a relentless, hollow rhythm against the brick walls, pooling around my scuffed work shoes. I pulled my cracked smartphone from my apron pocket, shivering slightly as the damp wind bit through my thin cotton uniform. I aimlessly scrolled through my feed, seeking a momentary mental escape from the smell of old fry oil. Then, Valerie's latest post stopped my thumb completely. Valerie stood in the center of Stanford & Associates' sprawling mahogany conference room, draped in a tailored cream designer blazer. She smiled radiantly at the camera lens, leaning over a massive, glossy architectural rendering spread prominently across the boardroom table. The caption beneath the photograph read, "So thrilled to officially unveil my newest conceptual design for the downtown Civic Plaza. Structural genius truly runs in the family." Below the caption, a flood of verified industry accounts poured fawning praise into the comment section. The top comment belonged to my father, William Stanford, who wrote, "Incredibly proud of my brilliant daughter, leading the next generation of our legacy." I zoomed in on the glossy rendering resting beneath her manicured fingertips. My breath hitched sharply in my throat, freezing in my lungs. The image displayed a sprawling, multi-tiered pedestrian plaza featuring a highly distinct, asymmetrical cantilevered pavilion roof, supported by raw timber and exposed steel beams. The angles were flawlessly calculated to maximize natural light during the winter solstice. It was a staggering masterpiece of urban integration. It was also completely, undeniably stolen. I recognized every single measurement of that cantilevered roof. I knew the exact mathematical gradient of the stepped concrete terraces. I knew it because I had studied the original. Hand-drawn blueprints for hundreds of hours. My grandfather, Thomas Stanford, had drafted that exact municipal plaza in the year 1998. Valerie had not changed a single structural line. She had merely rendered his fading, hand-drawn graphite sketches through modern 3-dimensional software, slapped her name in the title block, and presented his genius as her own. My jaw locked so tightly my teeth ground together. My grip on the plastic phone case tightened until the cheap material creaked audibly under the pressure. My father was not just content with erasing my future, he was actively digging up my grandfather's grave, stripping the flesh from his legacy to feed his talentless golden child. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect severed the final, fraying thread of my restraint. The sight of those stolen cantilevered beams dragged my mind violently backward, bridging a 15-year gap in time. I was 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on the worn wooden floor of my grandfather's attic drafting studio. The room smelled deeply of cedar shavings, sharp graphite, and old, rolled parchment. Thomas sat hunched over his heavy oak drafting table, his silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the slanted skylight. He did not look like the towering architectural titan the industry publicly praised. His shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling with heavy, exhausted breaths. He had just returned from a brutal board meeting with William, who was already aggressively maneuvering legal loopholes to push the older man out of his own firm. Thomas slowly set down his mechanical pencil. He turned on his wooden stool, the hinges squeaking softly, and motioned for me to approach. I stood up and walked to his side, resting my small hands on his knee. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tweed vest and pulled out a small, heavy object. He pressed it firmly into my open palm and folded my fingers tightly over it. The cold metal bit sharply into my skin. It was a tarnished brass key, its wide bow engraved with intricate, archaic geometric patterns. He looked down at me, his pale blue eyes fierce, unblinking, and entirely devoid of fear. "Your father measures a man's soul solely by the weight of his wallet, Josephine," Thomas whispered, his voice a low, raspy gravel that commanded the quiet room. "He will try to erase my name. He will try to consume everything I built to feed his own boundless vanity, and when he finishes picking my bones clean, he will inevitably turn his hunger toward you." He reached out and tapped his calloused finger against my closed fist. "This key belongs to lockbox 814 at the First Fidelity Depository downtown. I have secured the absolute truth inside. Do not open it tomorrow. Do not open it next year. You wait until he crosses the line of no return. You wait until you need a sword." The memory evaporated into the freezing rain, leaving me sitting on a damp milk crate in the desolate alleyway. William had officially crossed the line of no return. He had weaponized my grandfather's genius to inflate Valerie's fraudulent career, parading a dead man's brilliance to secure his own wealth. I shoved the cracked phone back into my pocket, stood up, and pushed through the heavy metal back door of the diner. I walked straight past the sizzling griddle. I untied the strings of my stained canvas apron, pulled the heavy fabric over my head, and laid it flat on the stainless steel prep counter. Ruby looked up from a sputtering basket of French fries, her brow furrowing slightly at my sudden movement. She looked at my face, read the cold, lethal resolve permanently setting into the lines of my jaw, and simply nodded. She wiped her grease-stained hands on a towel and pointed her chin toward the front exit. I walked out into the freezing downpour. I did not wait under the covered shelter for the city transit bus. I marched 30 blocks through the biting wind, my wet clothes clinging to my shivering skin, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The blistering pain in my bandaged heels completely vanished, entirely masked by a surging flood of pure, focused adrenaline. I reached the towering granite steps of the First Fidelity Depository. The building was a massive architectural relic constructed in the year 1920, a fortress of solid marble, polished brass fixtures, and soaring vaulted ceilings that echoed with the hushed, secretive whispers of old wealth. I bypassed the standard teller lines entirely. I approached the heavy mahogany desk of the vault manager, pulling my damp, laminated identification card and the tarnished brass key from my pocket. I placed them silently onto his pristine green leather desk blotter. The manager, a man in a crisp navy suit, inspected the heavy key, noted the archaic engraving, and immediately stood up. He did not ask a single question. He simply gestured for me to follow him. We walked down a long, silent corridor lined entirely with polished steel. He approached a massive, circular vault door, its thick steel locking bolts fully retracted into the frame. We stepped inside the climate-controlled chamber. The air felt sterile, smelling faintly of oiled metal and ancient, undisturbed paper. Walls of small, rectangular metal doors stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The manager stopped in the middle of the third aisle, crouched slightly, and inserted his long master key into the left keyhole of box 814. I stepped forward, my wet shoes squeaking softly against the polished marble tile. I inserted the tarnished brass key into the right keyhole. We turned our wrists in perfect, simultaneous synchronization. The heavy internal mechanism disengaged with a loud, satisfying metallic clack. The manager pulled the long, black metal tin from the slot, handed the heavy box to me, and silently backed out of the aisle, granting me total privacy. I walked to a small, isolated viewing room furnished with a single wooden table and a dim overhead lamp. I set the heavy metal box down on the polished wood. The cold steel chilled my fingertips. I flipped the latch upward and pushed the hinged lid open. The box was not filled with gold bullion or stacks of printed currency. Lying at the very top of a thick stack of municipal documents was a heavy, aged parchment envelope. The thick paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. I reached in and picked it up. It felt incredibly heavy, anchored by the profound weight of a dead man's foresight. Sealing the back flap was a thick pool of deep red wax, pressed deeply with my grandfather's distinctive architectural signet ring. As I broke the brittle red wax seal, 10 years of my grandfather's silent, protective fury spilled into my trembling hands. My grandfather had not simply left me an inheritance, he had meticulously constructed a loaded weapon. I tipped the heavy parchment envelope over the polished wooden table. A cascade of documents slid smoothly from the opening, spreading out under the dim, yellow glare of the overhead viewing lamp. The first object was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. Its spine was cracked and worn, smelling faintly of cedar and aged paper. I opened the heavy cover. The pages were densely packed with Thomas's sharp, precise architectural script. It was a comprehensive, chronological catalog of intellectual theft spanning over 2 decades. On the left side of every spread, my grandfather had pasted original, hand-drawn graphite sketches of commercial plazas, municipal courthouses, and structural retaining walls. He noted the exact dates of completion, all clustered throughout the 1980s and 1990s. On the corresponding right pages, he attached glossy newspaper clippings and corporate press releases from Stanford and Associates, featuring the exact same designs credited entirely to William Stanford. My father had not built a multi-million-dollar development empire. He had cannibalized a master architect's life work. My index finger traced a clipping from 1996, where my father proudly accepted a Regional Innovation Award for a cascading water feature Thomas had engineered 3 years prior. The depth of the fraud was staggering, meticulously documented with corresponding patent filing numbers and internal firm memorandums, proving William's intentional erasure of the original title blocks. I set the leather ledger aside, my jaw locking so tightly the muscles in my neck ached. Beneath the ledger lay a stack of heavy, legal-sized documents bound by a thick, dark blue silk ribbon. I untied the knot and spread the papers across the table. They were original, deeply embossed municipal land deeds. I ran my thumb over the raised, metallic seals of the city clerk's office. I scrutinized the geographical coordinates and lot numbers printed in bold, black ink. These were not sweeping acres of developable commercial real estate. They were narrow, highly specific utility parcels and foundational access roads. I recognized the geographical coordinates instantly. They mapped directly to the subterranean water mains and heavy equipment access routes bordering the city's dilapidated industrial harbor. This was the exact geographic footprint required to execute the upcoming Vanguard Municipal Waterfront Park project, without legal access to these specific strips of dirt. Any developer attempting to break ground on the massive coastal initiative would be completely and permanently landlocked. The deeds were legally registered to an irrevocable blind trust. The sole beneficiary listed on the finalized transfer documents was Josephine Stanford. I stared at the embossed seal, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Williams' firm was currently betting its entire over-leveraged existence on winning the Vanguard waterfront contract. He was leveraging massive, cross-collateralized loans against the assumption of securing that specific municipal land, yet sitting in this dusty bank vault. I held the absolute geographic bottleneck to his entire corporate survival. The final item resting at the bottom of the envelope was a smaller, folded piece of premium cardstock. It was addressed in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. The recipient was Miranda Cole, Chief Executive Officer, Vanguard Municipal Holdings. Attached to the sealed letter with a rusted brass paperclip was a handwritten note intended solely for my eyes. I carefully detached the note and read my grandfather's fading script. He detailed a freezing winter evening exactly 30 years ago. Miranda Cole was not a billionaire titan back then. She was a brilliant, marginalized junior architect relentlessly targeted by a group of toxic, wealthy male executives attempting to sabotage her first major structural bid. They tried to bury her blueprints and ruin her industry reputation. My grandfather, possessing significant influence at the height of his career, had stepped directly into the boardroom and staked his entire professional credibility on her genius. He forced the executives to evaluate her designs strictly on merit. That intervention secured her first monumental contract, launching the trajectory that built Vanguard Municipal Holdings. The note ended with a strict, unwavering directive. Thomas had instructed Miranda that if his granddaughter ever approached her firm, she was not to offer charity. She was to offer a shield against Williams' inevitable blacklist. She was to evaluate my portfolio blindly, ensuring my father's manufactured lies could not penetrate Vanguard's glass walls. I folded the note, placing it carefully into the pocket of my damp jeans. I looked at the ticking grandfather clock positioned in the corner of the silent viewing room. It was exactly 5 p.m. The national submission deadline for the Vanguard Municipal Waterfront Park project was exactly midnight tonight. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline flooded my veins, instantly vaporizing the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of the diner. I gathered the heavy municipal deeds, the leather-bound evidence ledger, and the sealed letter addressed to Miranda Cole. I placed them gently back into the black metal tin, closed the hinged lid, and secured the heavy latch. I left the viewing room, handed the metal box back to the vault manager in the polished steel corridor, and walked out of the First Fidelity Depository. The coastal rain continued to batter the city pavement, but I did not feel the freezing wind. I marched rapidly through the darkening streets, completely ignoring the painful, bursting blisters on my heels. I reached the graffiti-covered door of my apartment building, climbed the 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs, and unlocked my deadbolt. The relentless mechanical vibration from the 24-hour laundromat below rattled my cheap floorboards, but for the first time, the noise did not bother me. It sounded like the rhythmic beating of a war drum. I sat down at my unsteady folding table, opened my refurbished $250 laptop, and woke the screen. I opened the massive architectural file I had spent 4 agonizing years building in the shadows. I initiated the final rendering sequence. I meticulously reviewed the load-bearing calculations for the subterranean flood mitigation barriers. I verified the wind shear tolerances across the pedestrian suspension bridges and confirmed the eco-friendly concrete porosity metrics. The design was absolutely flawless. It was a staggering masterpiece of sustainable urban infrastructure that completely obliterated the generic, concrete-heavy commercial plazas my father slapped his name on. I opened my encrypted submission portal. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 11:45 at night. I had exactly 15 minutes before the National Registry closed permanently. I compressed the massive, high-definition architectural blueprints into a single, secure file. I rigorously scrubbed the documents of all identifying metadata, ensuring no digital fingerprint could be traced back to my cheap laptop. I routed the upload protocol through 3 separate, encrypted proxy servers located in foreign countries, completely masking my geographic origin. In the mandatory identification field, I entered the anonymous post office box I had rented 2 towns over, attaching a highly secure, untraceable email address. I attached a digital scan of my grandfather's sealed letter to Miranda Cole in the confidential sponsor annex, ensuring it would bypass the lower-level review boards and land directly on the chief executive officer's desk. I watched the progress bar inch across the pale blue screen, my breath catching in my throat as the percentage climbed. 98%, 99%. The digital clock struck 11:55 at night. A sharp, definitive chime echoed from the small speakers, and a bright green confirmation checkmark illuminated the dark, freezing room, armed with undeniable evidence and a quiet, burning clarity. I pressed the execution key, sending my anonymous designs directly into the heart of my father's empire. Betrayal does not always arrive with a shouted threat. Sometimes it wears a string of pearls and smells of expensive perfume. 3 days after I routed my anonymous architectural bid through the encrypted proxy servers, the bitter coastal rain broke, leaving the city locked in a dry, freezing cold. It was 2 in the afternoon on a remarkably sluggish Tuesday at Ruby's Diner. The chaotic lunch rush had completely cleared out, leaving only the low, mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerators and the faint hiss of the coffee machine heating up. I stood behind the main counter, my stained canvas apron tied tightly around my waist, meticulously refilling the heavy glass sugar dispensers. The brass bell mounted above the front entryway chimed with a sharp, high-pitched ring. I did not immediately look up. I simply unscrewed the metal cap of the next dispenser and poured the granulated sugar. The heavy, rhythmic click of expensive heels striking the peeling linoleum floor signaled that the newcomer was not one of our usual exhausted night shift nurses or local transit drivers. The footsteps marched purposefully past the empty booths, completely bypassing the "Please wait to be seated" sign, and stopped directly in front of the primary service counter. A suffocating, cloying cloud of imported floral perfume washed over the scent of stale bacon grease, aggressively invading my workspace. I set the heavy glass dispenser down and raised my eyes. My mother, Evelyn Stanford, stood on the opposite side of the scratched laminate counter. She wore a tailored, cream-colored cashmere trench coat securely belted at her waist, a heavy silk scarf draped elegantly over her shoulders, and her signature strand of flawless, perfectly round pearls resting flush against her collarbone. She looked at the worn red vinyl of the counter stools with undisguised revulsion. Reaching into her designer handbag, she withdrew a crisp white tissue, carefully wiped the surface of the seat, and finally sat down. She kept her spine rigidly straight, refusing to let her expensive coat brush against the metal edge of the counter. I did not gasp. I did not ask her why she had suddenly appeared after 4 years of absolute, undisturbed silence. I picked up a damp, bleach-soaked rag and began wiping the stainless steel surface of the espresso machine, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. Evelyn watched my hands. Her eyes tracked the rough, chemical-burned skin across my knuckles and the faded, fraying edges of my uniform. A brief flicker of disgust twitched at the corner of her mouth, quickly masked by a manufactured, highly rehearsed expression of maternal pity. "Josephine," she began, her voice a soft, melodic hum that completely lacked any genuine warmth. "Look at yourself. Look at what you are doing to your hands. This stubborn charade has gone on long enough." I did not offer a single syllable in response. I rinsed the rag in the metal sink, the water running over my calloused skin, and moved on to polish the chrome drip tray. My absolute silence unsettled her. In the towering, wealthy circles she navigated, people constantly spoke to fill the void, eager to appease the tension. I offered her absolutely nothing to work with. She let out a long, heavy sigh, shifting uncomfortably on the vinyl stool. She reached back into her imported leather handbag and pulled out a sleek, monogrammed checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. She unscrewed the cap with slow, deliberate rotations. The metal scratched sharply against the thick paper as she wrote. She tore the slip loose with a crisp snap and slid it across the scratched laminate counter, stopping exactly an inch from my damp rag. It was a personal check written out to my name for $500. "Your father and I are willing to let the past go," Evelyn stated, folding her hands neatly on top of her leather purse. She adopted a tone of fake, condescending pity, tilting her chin downward. We miss you at the estate. Valerie is overwhelmed with her new senior design responsibilities. Just apologize to your father. Come home. Pack up your things from whatever awful place you are living in, and come be Valerie's secretary. We will forgive the debt. You can have your comfortable life back." I looked down at the slip of paper. $500. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe designed to purchase my total submission and strip away the remaining shreds of my dignity. I did not touch the check. I picked up a dry towel and began polishing a stack of clean ceramic coffee mugs. My continued, impenetrable silence caused the polished porcelain mask on Evelyn's face to fracture. Her eyes darted around the empty diner, her polished fingernails tapping anxiously against the metal trim of the counter. Narcissists and their enablers abhor silence. It forces them to confront their own ugly reflections, desperate to regain control of the one-sided conversation. She kept talking, her voice pitching slightly higher, shedding its manufactured calm. "You have to be reasonable, Josephine," she hissed, leaning forward, her pearls clinking against the laminate surface. "William is under immense pressure right now. The atmosphere at the estate is completely unbearable. You have no idea what is at stake." I kept polishing the ceramic mug, my movements slow and deliberate, quietly baiting her to continue. "His commercial credit lines are entirely maxed out," Evelyn blurted, her anxiety overriding her usual strict discretion. "The banks are auditing his accounts every single week. He has cross-collateralized the main estate and the firm's primary operational funds just to qualify for the Vanguard Municipal Waterfront contract. He is betting the entire firm on winning this bid." My hands paused for a fraction of a second. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the white ceramic in my hands, but my mind snapped into absolute, terrifying focus. Evelyn was unraveling, spilling the closely guarded secrets of William's fraudulent empire simply because she could not handle the stress he was bringing home to her pristine, luxury estate. She was trying to recruit me to absorb his rage. "If he does not secure that Vanguard contract by the end of the month, the creditors are going to seize the house," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling with genuine, selfish panic. "He needs Valerie's portfolio to be absolutely flawless, and she cannot manage the drafting software alone. He needs you to swallow your pride and support your sister, so the firm presents a united, impenetrable front to the Vanguard Evaluation Board. You owe us this loyalty. Josephine." The puzzle pieces locked together with a resounding, heavy click. My father was not just aggressive, he was fundamentally bankrupt. He had built a massive house of cards, heavily leveraged on toxic, unpayable debt. He was betting his home, his firm, and his entire legacy on securing the exact municipal waterfront contract I had just anonymously applied for. Even better, his bid was entirely dependent on Valerie presenting my grandfather's stolen, complex blueprints she did not fundamentally understand and could not successfully render without my manual labor. He was drowning, and Evelyn had just walked into a diner to hand me the precise coordinates of the anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. I set the dry towel down. I turned around and walked slowly toward the counter. Evelyn smiled, visibly relaxing, her shoulders dropping. She genuinely believed her frantic, manipulative speech had worked. She thought the mention of losing the family estate had guilted me into returning to the cage. She pointed a manicured finger toward the crisp check resting on the laminate. "Take the $500, buy some decent clothes, and come to the office tomorrow morning," she commanded softly. I reached out and picked up the paper check. I held it gently between my thumbs and index fingers. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, holding her gaze with a cold, unblinking intensity. I did not yell, I did not hurl insults or demand an apology for 4 years of calculated abandonment. I applied a slow, deliberate pressure to my wrists. The sharp, tearing sound of thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet, empty diner. I tore the check perfectly, cleanly in half. I placed the right half of the severed paper directly on top of the left half, securing them together. Then, I tore the stack in half again. I placed the 4 useless, shredded pieces of her pathetic bribe back onto the counter, pushing them exactly 1 inch toward her manicured hand. Evelyn gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air. The remaining color instantly drained from her heavily powdered face. She stared at the torn paper as if I had just reached across the counter and physically struck her. The realization that she possessed absolutely no power over me hit her with the crushing force of a collapsed ceiling. Her shock instantly morphed into indignant, humiliated fury. She snatched her heavy silk scarf, threw it haphazardly around her neck, and snatched her designer handbag off the counter. Her stool scraped violently against the linoleum as she stood up. "You are a stubborn, ungrateful fool," she spat, her voice a venomous, shaking hiss. "You will spend the rest of your miserable life scrubbing grease off these floors." I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I picked up my damp rag and smoothly wiped the exact spot where her check had rested, physically erasing her presence from my counter before she had even reached the door. She turned on her expensive heels and stormed out of the diner, pushing the heavy wooden door open so aggressively that the brass bell rattled violently against the glass. I walked around the service counter and stepped up to the large, grease-smudged front window. I watched her expensive luxury sedan pull away from the curb, knowing her pathetic attempt at bribery had just handed me the exact blueprint of my father's vulnerability. The digital notification illuminating my cracked phone screen carried the weight of a shifted paradigm. It was 11 at night on Tuesday. I sat perfectly still on the edge of my narrow mattress in the freezing darkness of my 300-square-foot apartment. The relentless, mechanical vibration from the 24-hour laundromat below rattled my cheap floorboards, but I did not feel the tremor. My eyes were locked entirely on the stark white inbox of my encrypted proxy email account. The subject line was remarkably simple: Vanguard Municipal Holdings, Phase 1 finalist selection. I clicked the heavy trackpad of my refurbished laptop. The email contained no excessive corporate pleasantries. It was a sterile, highly secure internal memorandum officially confirming that anonymous applicant 814 had completely bypassed the preliminary review boards. The staggering complexity and undeniable structural genius of my sustainable waterfront park had triggered an immediate executive override. The message contained a single, non-negotiable directive. I was summoned to present my physical portfolio in person at the Vanguard corporate headquarters on the following Monday at 9 in the morning. I closed the laptop, the screen going black. I had 5 days to prepare for the boardroom that would decide my fate. However, arrogance demands immediate, crushing retaliation when it is denied control. My father's response to my silent, methodical shredding of Evelyn's bribe arrived exactly 8 hours later. At precisely 7 in the morning on Wednesday, a violent metallic pounding rattled the cheap wooden frame of my apartment door. I stood up, pulled on a thick wool sweater, and turned the deadbolt. 2 heavily armed municipal police officers stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway, flanked by a city zoning inspector wearing a bright yellow safety vest. The inspector held a staple gun and a stack of thick, bright red, heavy cardstock placards. He did not look me in the eye. He stared at his clipboard, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone. He recited a sudden, catastrophic structural failure diagnosis for the entire building. He claimed the city had received an emergency anonymous tip regarding compromised load-bearing foundations and severe black mold infestations in the ventilation systems. According to his paperwork, the building was officially condemned, completely unfit for human habitation, and slated for immediate city seizure. It was a massive, bureaucratic sledgehammer swung by William Stanford's vast commercial real estate connections. He could not force me to accept a $500 check, so he simply made a single phone call to a corrupt municipal zoning commissioner and legally erased my shelter. He intended to throw me onto the freezing concrete, assuming the sheer terror of sudden homelessness would force me to crawl back to his estate and beg for Valerie's unpaid secretarial position. "You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your essential belongings and vacate the premises," the zoning inspector stated, stapling the bright red condemnation notice directly into the wood of my door. "Anyone remaining inside the perimeter after the deadline will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Down the hall, doors opened. The exhausted, low-income tenants began to panic. I heard the sharp sound of a young mother crying, desperately asking the officers where she was supposed to take her children in the freezing rain. The chaos William manufactured to punish one person washed over dozens of innocent collateral victims. I did not beg the officers for an extension. I did not waste my precious breath attempting to explain the blatant corruption to heavily armed men simply following orders. I turned away from the door, my face an absolute mask of stone, and walked to my closet. I pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag off the top shelf. I did not pack my cheap, threadbare sheets or my battered winter boots. I packed my weapons. I secured my refurbished laptop in a padded sleeve, coiled the charging cables, and placed the tarnished brass key to my grandfather's lockbox securely in a zippered pocket. Finally, I unhooked my dark, tailored consignment blazer from the hanging rod. I had purchased it 3 months ago from a thrift store, saving $12 a week until I could afford the heavy, structured wool. I wrapped the fabric carefully inside a plastic dry cleaning bag to protect it from the damp air and laid it flat against the bottom of the canvas bag. Exactly 14 minutes later, I walked out of my apartment. I descended the 3 flights of stairs, passing the weeping tenants and the officers cordoning off the entryway with thick yellow tape, without looking back. I walked 30 blocks through the biting coastal wind, the heavy canvas strap digging painfully into my shoulder. I pushed through the heavy wooden door of Ruby's diner just before 8 in the morning. The breakfast rush had not yet begun. Ruby stood behind the stainless steel counter, pouring a massive bag of coffee beans into the industrial grinder. She stopped, the machine falling silent, and looked at the heavy canvas bag slung over my shoulder. She did not ask for a single explanation. She looked at the red, wind-chapped skin on my face, set the empty plastic bag down, and tilted her chin toward the back hallway. I walked past the hot griddle and pushed open the heavy wooden door to the dry storage room. It was a narrow, windowless space smelling intensely of bulk flour, dried oregano, and caustic industrial floor cleaner. Towers of heavy aluminum cans containing crushed tomatoes and sliced peaches lined the cinder block walls. In the back corner, wedged tightly between a massive sack of pinto beans and the walk-in refrigerator compressor, Ruby had already dragged a small, folding aluminum cot. A single, thin gray wool blanket rested on the thin mattress. I set my canvas bag down on a wooden crate of yellow onions. I untied my heavy winter coat, reached into my bag, and pulled out my stained canvas work apron. I tied the strings tightly behind my waist and walked straight back onto the diner floor, picking up a pot of hot coffee before the first customer even sat down. For the next 4 days, my existence was stripped down to absolute, punishing functionality. I worked double shifts, scrubbing the cracked red vinyl booths and hauling heavy bus tubs full of dirty dishes until the tendons in my wrists burned with a hot, agonizing fire at night when the diner finally closed and the heavy deadbolts were thrown. I retreated to the freezing storage room. The industrial refrigerator compressor kicked on and off, vibrating the concrete floor beneath my thin aluminum cot. I slept for exactly 3 hours a night. For the remaining hours of the dark morning, I sat on an overturned plastic bucket, using a stack of cardboard boxes as a makeshift desk. I opened my laptop and relentlessly reviewed the Vanguard files. I memorized every single structural load calculation. I mentally recited the complex wind shear tolerances of the suspension bridges. I rehearsed the specific ecological benefits of the subterranean flood mitigation barriers until the words etched themselves permanently into the back of my eyelids. I was a phantom operating in the shadows of a grease-stained diner, heavily armed with the exact coordinates of my father's destruction. Monday morning arrived with a bitter, biting frost coating the diner windows. At exactly 5 in the morning, the kitchen was entirely silent. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, steady hum. I stood in the center of the kitchen, having scrubbed my hands and face meticulously with harsh industrial soap in the small employee sink. I unfolded a large, pristine white cotton towel and laid it completely flat across the long, stainless steel prep counter, ensuring absolutely no cross-contamination from the food surfaces. I pulled my dark consignment blazer from its protective plastic sheath and laid it over the white fabric. I plugged Ruby's ancient, battered clothes iron into a heavy-duty wall outlet. I waited for the thick iron sole plate to heat up. When a drop of water hissed and evaporated instantly against the hot metal, I began to press the blazer. My movements were slow, clinical, and precise. I drove the heavy iron across the dark wool, flattening every minor crease and wrinkle born from the canvas duffel bag. I pressed the sharp angles of the lapels, ensuring the fabric laid perfectly flush against my chest. The hot steam rose into the cold kitchen air, smelling faintly of clean wool and hot metal. I unplugged the iron and set it aside. I slipped my arms into the heavy sleeves of the blazer. The structured shoulders settled perfectly into place, transforming my posture, erasing the tired waitress, and resurrecting the brilliant, lethal architect. I buttoned the freshly tailored lapels of my dark blazer in the reflection of a greasy diner window, ready to walk into the corporate fortress my father desperately wanted to conquer. The 50th floor boardroom of Vanguard Municipal Holdings was a sterile landscape of glass and ambition, designed to intimidate the weak. I stepped out of the high-speed elevator at exactly 8:45 in the morning. The executive reception area was a massive, echoing expanse of polished white marble and brushed steel. 4 other finalists sat on low-profile black leather sofas. They were older men in tailored, bespoke Italian suits, sporting expensive platinum watches and exuding an air of inherited, untouchable entitlement. When I walked in, their quiet, confident conversation died instantly. One man, adjusting a heavy gold cufflink, looked me up and down. His eyes lingered heavily on the slight fraying at the cuffs of my consignment blazer and the scuffs I could not completely polish out of my black work shoes. He did not say a single word, but his upper lip curled into a distinct, arrogant sneer before he purposefully turned his back to me. I completely ignored him. I walked away from the seating area and stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I looked down at the sprawling, gray industrial harbor far below, the exact jagged coastline I was planning to fundamentally transform. I waited in absolute silence until the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom finally clicked open. An executive assistant holding a digital tablet stepped into the room and called out my anonymous submission number, applicant 814. I walked past the sneering men, my footsteps silent against the thick carpet, and stepped into the boardroom. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly sealing out the ambient noise of the reception area. Miranda Cole sat at the head of a massive, polished concrete conference table. She was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, silver hair cut into a severe bob and eyes as cold and calculating as a winter storm. She wore a dark, highly structured suit devoid of any flashy jewelry or unnecessary accessories. She did not stand, and she did not offer her hand in a polite greeting. She simply gestured to the single empty black chair positioned on the opposite end of the long table. I walked forward and sat down, planting my feet firmly on the floor. For a long, suffocating moment, she just studied me. Her gaze swept over my faded consignment blazer, reading the silent history of grease burns, freezing walks, and physical exhaustion mapped out in the cheap fabric. I did not break eye contact. I did not fidget, adjust my collar, or attempt to fill the heavy silence with nervous chatter. Then, Miranda reached into the dark leather briefcase resting beside her chair. She pulled out a heavy parchment envelope sealed with deep red wax. It was an exact replica of the envelope I had opened in the dusty bank vault just days ago. The thick wax bore the identical, distinctive impression of my grandfather's architectural signet ring. She slid her thumb under the flap and cracked the brittle wax open, exposing the aged, handwritten letter Thomas had sent her 10 years ago. The entire room went dead silent, the air growing instantly thick with the profound gravity of a dead man's foresight. Miranda set the letter flat on the concrete table. She leaned forward, intertwining her fingers. Thomas Stanford saved my career 30 years ago when the entire industry tried to bury me alive, she stated, her voice a low, commanding register that vibrated slightly against the glass walls. He walked into a room full of arrogant men and gave me an impenetrable shield. When he sent me this letter, he asked me to do the exact same thing for you, but he was incredibly specific. She tapped her index finger sharply against the aged parchment. "He instructed me to let you fall. He told me that when William inevitably blacklisted you, I was not to intervene, and I was absolutely not to offer you charity. He said you needed to learn the brutal reality of the concrete before you could ever be trusted to build on it. He wanted you to forge your own armor." Miranda paused, her cold eyes softening for a microscopic fraction of a second. "I have watched you for 4 years. Josephine, I watched your father systematically slam every commercial door in this city in your face. I watched you carry dirty dishes and scrub vinyl booths for minimum wage. I waited for you to break. I fully expected you to eventually crawl back to his estate and surrender your dignity for a warm bed. You never did. You stood in the freezing shadows and built an absolute masterpiece." She reached back into her briefcase and extracted a thick, heavily bound portfolio. It was a high-resolution, physical printing of my Vanguard Municipal Waterfront Park submission. She flipped open the heavy cover, revealing my complex subterranean load-bearing calculations and the intricate ecological blueprints. "This design," Miranda said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute, unvarnished professional reverence, "is staggering. Your wind shear tolerance calculations for the pedestrian suspension bridges are flawless. Your integration of the phytoremediation zones fundamentally outclasses every single commercial developer in this state, including your father. You did not just meet our rigorous conceptual requirements, you entirely redefined them." She flipped the page, landing on a structural comparison chart. "William Stanford is currently tearing this city apart trying to secure this exact contract. He submitted his preliminary bid late last night. He is utilizing a stolen, deeply flawed rendition of your grandfather's cantilevered plaza because his daughter lacks your fundamental structural comprehension. Her load-bearing calculations on the foundational terraces are catastrophically inaccurate. If we built her design, the entire structure would collapse under the coastal wind shear within 5 years. They are offering us a painted tomb." She closed the heavy portfolio with a loud, definitive snap. She pulled a crisp, legally binding corporate contract from a manila folder and slid it across the concrete table, accompanied by a heavy black fountain pen. "I am not hiring you as a junior drafter, Josephine. I am hiring you as the lead urban developer for Vanguard Municipal Holdings," Miranda declared. "However, your father cannot know you are the architect behind the winning bid until the final groundbreaking ceremony. We will bury your identity beneath a heavily protected corporate alias, J. Thomas Associates. You will hold the absolute unquestioned authority over every single municipal access road and utility parcel required for this project. You will be the executioner." I looked down at the crisp contract resting on the polished concrete. The salary listed was a staggering $250,000 annually, accompanied by full executive benefits and total creative control over the multi-million-dollar waterfront project. It was the exact power my father had tried to violently steal from me, magnified by a factor of 10. I picked up the heavy black pen. My hand did not shake. I signed my full legal name on the dotted line, the dark ink bleeding sharply into the pristine white paper. Miranda stood up, finally extending her hand across the long table. I stood and met her grip. Her handshake was like a steel vice, locking our alliance into place. I gathered my copy of the executed contract, slid it securely into my canvas duffel bag, and turned toward the heavy frosted glass doors. As I walked out into the reception area, the 4 elite finalists were still sitting on the leather sofas, their arrogant smirks firmly in place. They checked their platinum watches, completely unaware that the war had just ended before they even stepped onto the battlefield. I walked out of that skyscraper with a lucrative contract in my bag, fully aware that I was now the absolute gatekeeper to my father's survival. True power does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly in the form of a stack of manila folders placed on a mahogany desk. It was exactly 8 in the morning on Tuesday, precisely 24 hours after Miranda Cole handed me the keys to my own absolute authority. I sat in the center of a massive, glass-walled corner office on the 50th floor of Vanguard Municipal Holdings. The air inside the room was cool, heavily filtered, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and citrus polish. The relentless, deafening mechanical vibration of the laundromat below my old apartment was entirely gone. The suffocating stench of old bacon grease and burnt coffee grounds from Ruby's Diner had been permanently scrubbed from my skin. My new reality was completely silent. The heavy, soundproof glass surrounding my office physically separated me from the chaotic hum of the corporate bullpen outside. I reached out and ran my fingertips across the smooth, unblemished surface of my expansive mahogany desk. I was no longer the exhausted waitress bandaging blistered heels in a freezing storage room. I was J. Thomas Associates, the invisible, heavily guarded executive entity placed in absolute control of the largest municipal development project in the state. The heavy oak door to my office clicked open. An executive assistant in a crisp charcoal suit walked in, carrying a large, reinforced plastic crate. He did not ask for my coffee order or attempt to engage in idle morning conversation. He understood the profound gravity of the room. He simply lifted 5 massive, heavily bound contractor portfolios from the crate and stacked them squarely in the center of my desk. He offered a single, respectful nod and backed out of the office, the heavy door ceiling completely shut behind him. These were the final competitor bids for the Vanguard Municipal Waterfront Park project. I pulled the first 4 binders toward me. For the next 3 hours, I methodically dismantled them. I utilized my dual monitors to cross-reference their proposed load-bearing concrete matrices against strict federal ecological standards. I struck through 3 of the proposals with a heavy red pen, rejecting them for utilizing highly toxic soil treatments and inadequate storm surge barriers. They were standard, unimaginative corporate bids, lacking the visionary sustainability Miranda Cole demanded. I pushed the 4 rejected binders to the edge of my desk. I pulled the 5th and final portfolio directly into the center of my workspace. It was an incredibly ostentatious presentation. The binder was bound in thick, textured black leather, featuring a heavy, gold-embossed seal stamped directly into the center of the cover, Stanford and Associates. I flipped the heavy leather cover open. The first page was a glossy, high-resolution introductory letter printed on incredibly expensive, heavy-weight cardstock. At the very bottom of the page, occupying nearly a third of the available space, was Valerie's signature. It was a massive, looping, heavily stylized scrawl executed in thick blue ink. William had completely removed his own name from the lead architect designation. To qualify for specific municipal diversity grants and secure aggressive public relations leverage, he had officially listed his 24-year-old daughter as the sole structural visionary and absolute lead on the project. I turned the page. Diving directly into the comprehensive financial annex, William was aggressively petitioning Vanguard for a massive, upfront municipal advance of exactly $15 million to initiate the coastal excavation phase. To legally qualify for an advance of that magnitude, the bidding firm had to prove total financial solvency and provide absolute collateral. I opened his attached bank statements and commercial leverage documents. The numbers printed on the page painted a picture of absolute, terrifying desperation. My father was entirely bankrupt. His primary commercial operating accounts held barely $3 million in liquid capital. To secure the mandatory performance bonds for this specific bid, he had cross-collateralized every single asset attached to his name. He had leveraged the family's sprawling luxury estate, officially appraised at exactly $12 million, directly against the firm's commercial credit lines. Furthermore, he had taken out predatory, high-yield bridge loans at 18% interest just to keep the lights on at his downtown corporate headquarters. He was operating at over 100% debt capacity. It was a massive, fragile house of cards built entirely on toxic, unpayable debt. If Vanguard rejected this specific bid, the predatory lenders would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings. Within 30 days, the bank would physically lock the doors to his corporate firm, and the authorities would seize his luxury vehicles, his imported furniture, and the sprawling estate Evelyn loved more than her own children. I picked up my black fountain pen. I did not smile, and I did not laugh. I clinically circled the fraudulent liquidity metrics, formally documenting his blatant attempt to mask his impending insolvency from a federal oversight board. I closed the financial annex and broke the seal on the final section of the binder. I carefully unfolded the massive, size A0 architectural blueprints, spreading the heavy paper completely across my mahogany desk. There it was, my grandfather's cantilevered municipal plaza, originally drafted in 1998, stared back at me in high definition, three-dimensional rendering. Valerie had copied the exact aesthetic slopes of the roofline and the precise angles of the tiered concrete terraces. However, a beautiful aesthetic rendering is entirely useless if the structural physics are mathematically impossible. Valerie did not understand the profound, invisible mechanics of Thomas Stanford's genius. She had treated the complex architectural blueprint like a simple coloring book. I pulled my brass architectural scale ruler from my top drawer and laid it flat against her subterranean structural cross-sections. To cut massive excavation costs and artificially inflate the firm's proposed profit margins, Valerie had reduced the depth of the foundational concrete anchors by exactly 50%. She had completely deleted the massive, subterranean steel counterweights required to safely anchor a cantilevered structure of that immense magnitude. She simply assumed the heavy concrete would magically hold itself up. Furthermore, she had completely ignored the aggressive, highly corrosive coastal wind shear metrics. She utilized standard commercial glass for the massive pavilion windows, failing to specify the high-tension, impact-resistant polycarbonate required for a hurricane-prone coastal zone. If Vanguard actually funded this bid, and Stanford and Associates poured the concrete, the structure would become a massive, lethal trap. The sheer weight of the unsupported cantilevered roof, combined with the extreme atmospheric pressure of the coastal wind shear, would snap the shallow concrete anchors like dry twigs. The entire multi-tiered plaza would violently collapse within 36 months of a public grand opening, causing catastrophic loss of human life. Submitting this blueprint to a municipal authority was not merely an act of desperate corporate plagiarism. It was a severe, documented instance of federal engineering fraud. I did not immediately reject the bid and send it back to his office. A simple rejection would allow William to quietly pivot and victimize another municipal developer. I intended to permanently dismantle his ability to ever hold a pen in this industry again. I reached for a stack of sterile, red-bordered federal compliance forms. I maintained absolute, chilling composure as my pen scratched rhythmically against the paper. I documented every single lie, every hidden toxic debt, and every mathematically impossible structural load calculation. I built a comprehensive, undeniable legal dossier proving intentional municipal fraud, packaging my grandfather's stolen legacy into a tightly sealed evidentiary bomb. I traced the stolen lines of my grandfather's design on their fraudulent application, feeling the heavy steel trap of federal justice click open. A cornered narcissist operates under the delusion that everyone has a price, and my father ambushed me by the lobby elevators to state mine. It was exactly 8 in the morning on Wednesday. The sprawling, high-vaulted marble foyer of Vanguard Municipal Holdings hummed with the quiet, concentrated energy of extreme corporate wealth. High-powered executives in bespoke tailored suits moved swiftly across the polished granite floors, their voices hushed, their briefcases locked. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors, brushing a thin layer of morning frost from the shoulders of my dark consignment blazer. I carried a simple, worn canvas messenger bag over my shoulder, blending seamlessly into the periphery as just another invisible gear in the massive corporate machine. I crossed the expansive lobby, making my way toward the secure, executive elevator bank reserved strictly for the highest tier of Vanguard leadership. My proximity access badge, bearing the encrypted J. Thomas Associates alias, rested heavy in my right pocket. I was mentally preparing to return to my glass-walled office on the 50th floor to finalize the legal destruction of the Stanford and Associates bid. Before I could even reach into my pocket for the plastic card, a heavy, suffocating scent of stale cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and sour, nervous sweat washed over me. A massive hand clamped down violently onto my left bicep. The thick fingers dug sharply through the dark wool of my blazer, grinding my flesh directly against the underlying bone. The sheer physical force of the grip abruptly halted my forward momentum, violently jerking my shoulder backward. I did not gasp. I did not stumble or attempt to pull away. I simply planted my scuffed black work shoes firmly against the polished marble floor, locking my knees, and slowly turned my head. William Stanford stood exactly 6 inches from my face. He wore his signature charcoal pinstripe suit and a heavy gold watch, but the pristine, untouchable facade he maintained at his luxury estate was heavily fractured. The skin around his eyes was puffy and dark, mapping out several consecutive nights of severe sleep deprivation. A thin sheen of frantic, greasy sweat coated his forehead, catching the bright recessed lighting of the ceiling. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his silk tie. He had clearly been pacing the ground floor for hours, desperately waiting for an impromptu audience with any Vanguard executive who would not return his frantic phone calls. His bloodshot eyes darted rapidly up and down my frame, taking in the slightly frayed cuffs of my blazer and the worn canvas strap across my chest. His upper lip curled into a sneer of absolute, condescending disgust. "I should have known you would end up scrubbing the baseboards in a place like this," William hissed, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that barely contained his boiling panic. He leaned in closer, attempting to physically tower over me, utilizing his sheer size to manufacture authority. "They legally evicted you from that rat-infested apartment, and now you are fetching coffee and carrying mail for real architects. Look at you. You are a complete, absolute disgrace to the Stanford name." He genuinely believed I was a low-level administrative clerk or a janitorial assistant. His massive, blinding arrogance could not even begin to process the possibility that the woman standing before him in a thrift store blazer was the absolute gatekeeper to the multi-million-dollar municipal contract he needed to survive. I maintained an absolute, suffocating silence. I kept my face entirely blank, my jaw relaxed, and my eyes locked dead on his heavily flushed face. My lack of a verbal defense infuriated him. His grip on my arm tightened, his fingernails biting painfully through the dark wool fabric. He leaned his head forward until his mouth hovered just inches from my ear. "You are going to make yourself useful for once in your miserable life. Josephine," he demanded, the scent of stale black coffee rolling off his rapid breath. "I know they keep the sealed competitor bids in the ground floor courier holding room before they send them up to the evaluation board. You have a building badge. You are going to walk into that room right now. You are going to take the files belonging to the top 3 development firms, and you are going to hand them to me." I stared at him, letting the sheer unadulterated insanity of his demand hang in the cold air. He was standing in the highly secured lobby of a federal municipal contractor, surrounded by high-definition security cameras, actively attempting to extort his own daughter into committing severe corporate espionage. He wanted me to risk decades in federal prison, simply to hand him an unfair advantage. He was drowning in his own toxic debt, and he was perfectly willing to chain me to his sinking ship just for an extra breath of air. When I did not immediately nod or cower in submission, William attempted to deploy his ultimate leverage. "If you do this for me," he whispered, his tone shifting into a sickening, manipulative cadence, "I will forgive your massive debt. I will let you move back into the estate. You can sleep in a real bed, eat decent food, and work as Valerie's secretary. I will give you your comfortable life back. But if you refuse me right now, I will personally ensure this firm fires you by noon. I know the executives here. I will tell them you are a thief, and you will be back on the street freezing to death by nightfall." He presented a choice between federal prison and unpaid servitude, framing it as a generous, paternal rescue. I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. I slowly, deliberately shifted my gaze downward, tracing the line of his tailored sleeve down to the heavy, sweating hand gripping my arm. I stared directly at his knuckles. I did not try to pull away. I did not struggle against his physical dominance. I simply looked at his hand as if it were a disgusting, dead insect resting on my coat. My complete lack of fear, my absolute refusal to engage with his chaotic, desperate energy, functioned like a mirror reflecting his own profound impotence. His breathing hitched. The thick muscles in his jaw fluttered erratically. He expected me to cry, to beg for his mercy, or to furiously whisper my defense. My freezing, statuesque composure began to deeply unnerve him. From the periphery of my vision, I registered movement. The Vanguard lobby security desk was manned by two heavily built, highly trained guards wearing dark blue tactical uniforms. The subtle, unnatural tension of our physical proximity had caught their attention. One of the guards tapped his partner on the shoulder, unclipped his heavy radio from his belt, and stepped out from behind the polished marble reception desk. He began walking purposefully across the granite floor directly toward the executive elevator bank, his eyes locked firmly on my father's hand. William noticed the approaching guard. His eyes widened, a sudden spike of genuine terror piercing through his arrogant facade. He was heavily over-leveraged, facing imminent bankruptcy, and standing on the absolute precipice of corporate ruin. The very last thing he could afford was to be publicly dragged out of the Vanguard corporate headquarters in handcuffs for physically assaulting a female employee in the main lobby. It would permanently obliterate his already fragile credibility. His massive fingers suddenly sprang open, releasing my arm as if the dark wool of my blazer had suddenly caught fire. He took a rapid, stumbling step backward, desperately attempting to smooth the wrinkled lapels of his charcoal suit jacket. He pasted a stiff, manufactured smile onto his sweating face, trying to project the image of a calm, collected businessman having a casual conversation. The approaching security guard slowed his pace, his hand resting cautiously on his radio, watching the sudden separation. William leaned forward one final time, his voice a frantic, venomous hiss barely audible over the ambient hum of the lobby. "You will severely regret ignoring me, Josephine," he spat, a small bead of sweat rolling down the side of his temple. "When I sign this massive waterfront contract next week, I will own this entire city. I will buy that pathetic diner just to bulldoze it to the dirt. You are absolute garbage." I did not rub my bruised arm. I calmly reached into my pocket, withdrew my heavy, encrypted proximity access badge, and pressed it flat against the glowing black security scanner mounted next to the executive elevator doors. The machine emitted a sharp, pleasant chime. The heavy steel doors slid silently open, revealing the empty, polished, wood-paneled interior. I stepped inside, turning slowly to face the lobby. William stood frozen on the polished granite floor, his chest heaving, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He watched the elevator panels illuminate, realizing with sudden, horrifying clarity that I was not scanning into the janitorial service lifts. I was standing inside the highly restricted executive carriage, possessing access clearance he could not even begin to afford. His face flushed a violent, mottled red as I stepped onto the executive elevator, leaving his pathetic, shouted threats echoing uselessly in the marble foyer. A desperately arrogant man will always attempt to burn down the house rather than admit he does not own the keys. The executive elevator doors had sealed my father out, but the image of my proximity badge flashing green against the secure scanner fundamentally shattered his reality. He did not return to his downtown office to review his financial ledgers or verify Valerie's structural load calculations. He spent the next 24 hours frantically working his rapidly decaying network of municipal contacts, aggressively demanding to know exactly how his estranged daughter had bypassed the Vanguard security perimeter. He did not discover the heavily encrypted J. Thomas Associates, alias. His limited patriarchal arrogance simply could not fathom that a woman he had forced to scrub diner booths for 4 years was now commanding a $250,000 salary as a lead urban developer. Instead, his contacts confirmed a partial truth: Josephine Stanford was currently employed within the Vanguard Internal Evaluation Department. That microscopic sliver of information terrified him. His massive, highly fraudulent municipal bid, the heavy black binder currently resting on my mahogany desk, was entirely dependent on sliding quietly past the initial evaluation clerks. If he believed I was one of those clerks, he assumed I held the power to simply shred his application before the executive board ever saw it. His reaction was immediate, venomous, and highly documented. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon on Thursday. I sat in my soundproof glass office, meticulously binding the comprehensive federal engineering fraud dossier I had compiled against Stanford and Associates. I aligned the edges of the thick stack of red-bordered compliance forms, the undeniable proof of his stolen architectural blueprints and toxic cross-collateralized debt resting heavily under my palms. The sleek black telephone on the corner of my desk chimed a single, soft note. I pressed the flashing silver button. Miranda Cole's executive assistant spoke through the crisp speaker, informing me that the chief executive officer required my immediate presence in the primary boardroom. I did not rush. I placed my black fountain pen perfectly parallel to my notepad, stood up, and smoothed the lapels of my dark consignment blazer. I walked out of my office, navigating the quiet, carpeted corridors of the 50th floor until I reached the massive frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom. Miranda Cole sat at the head of the polished concrete conference table, framed by the sprawling, gray industrial harbor visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. She did not have her laptop open. She was not reviewing blueprints. Resting squarely in the center of the vast concrete surface was a single, thick manila folder. I pulled out the black leather chair to her right and sat down, resting my hands quietly on the cold table. Miranda looked at me, her sharp silver hair catching the overcast light from the windows. She reached out and flipped the manila folder open. "Your father is a remarkably predictable creature, Josephine," Miranda stated, her voice a low, steady hum that carried effortlessly across the empty boardroom. "He realizes he cannot control you in the shadows anymore, so he is attempting to drag you into the light and burn you at the stake." She slid a thick stack of heavy, cream-colored paper across the table. The top sheet bore the massive, gold-embossed letterhead of Stanford and Associates. It was heavily stamped with a bright red, urgent priority seal from the Vanguard Board of Directors' Internal Grievance Committee. I looked down at the document. It was a formal, aggressively worded corporate ethics complaint. William had bypassed the standard vendor communication channels and filed a direct, highly public grievance with the highest governing body of Vanguard Municipal Holdings. I read the text, my eyes tracking his frantic, heavy keystrokes. William formally accused Vanguard of harboring a known, malicious corporate thief. He explicitly named me, Josephine Stanford. He detailed the completely fabricated story of how I had supposedly embezzled $4,000 in technical equipment from his firm 4 years ago, painting me as a deeply unstable, embittered, and estranged family member. The core of his complaint was a massive, preemptive strike against his own impending failure. He claimed that because Stanford and Associates had submitted an absolutely flawless, superior municipal bid, I had maliciously infiltrated the Vanguard evaluation department to exact personal revenge. He accused me of actively planning to sabotage his daughter's brilliant architectural submission. He concluded the aggressive document with a strict, non-negotiable demand. He required the Vanguard Board of Directors to convene an immediate, formal ethics tribunal. He demanded that I be dragged before the executive committee, officially stripped of my security clearance, and physically escorted from the premises by armed security. He wanted a public execution to ensure his fraudulent bid faced absolutely no internal resistance. He sent copies of this formal complaint to 3 separate municipal oversight committees and the regional banking syndicate financing his bridge loans, Miranda noted, leaning back in her chair and resting her elbows on the armrests. He is laying the groundwork for an appeal. If his bid is rejected, he is completely bankrupt. By filing this complaint, he is manufacturing a scapegoat. When we deny his application, he will cry foul to his lenders, claiming Vanguard engaged in unethical practices by allowing his estranged, vindictive daughter to illegally sabotage his firm. It was a calculated, cornered rat survival tactic. He was attempting to weaponize his own lies to buy himself an extension on his toxic debt. I did not clench my jaw. I did not raise my voice in defensive outrage. I simply stared at the heavy cream paper, tracing the gold-embossed seal of the firm my grandfather had built from the ground up, the firm my father was actively driving into the dirt. The board of directors is legally obligated to respond to a formal ethics complaint from a registered municipal vendor, Miranda continued, watching my face closely for any sign of emotional fracture. They have requested my recommendation on how to proceed. I can quietly squash this. I can bury his complaint in endless bureaucratic red tape, cite your highly encrypted alias, and simply reject his bid on the structural merits without ever acknowledging his letter. We can make him disappear in the dark. I looked up from the document, meeting Miranda's cold, calculating gaze. No, I replied, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of fear. If we bury his complaint in the dark, he will spend the next 10 years whispering to every commercial developer in this state that Vanguard cheated him. He will play the victim. He will claim Valerie was a misunderstood genius robbed by a corrupt system. Arrogance like his does not die in the shadows. It only mutates. I picked up the formal complaint, aligning the edges of the heavy cream paper with a sharp tap against the concrete table. He explicitly requested a formal ethics tribunal, I stated, sliding the document back toward the center of the table. I say we grant his request. We give him the exact stage he is begging for. Schedule the hearing for Monday morning. Tell him to bring his primary investors, his corporate lawyers, and Valerie. Tell him Vanguard takes these allegations incredibly seriously, and the board will personally evaluate his claims of structural superiority against the alleged sabotage. Miranda's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of profound, lethal respect illuminating her sharp features. She understood the exact architecture of the trap I was building. You want to let him walk into this boardroom believing he is holding the executioner's axe, Miranda murmured, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across her stoic face. He built a massive house of cards based entirely on the assumption that nobody would ever check his structural mathematics, I replied, my tone dropping to a cold, clinical absolute. He is betting his entire legacy that I will cower and run away before the tribunal even convenes. Let him walk in here with his chest puffed out. Let him present my grandfather's stolen blueprints to the Vanguard Executive Board on the official municipal record. Once he formally enters those fraudulent documents into federal evidence under Valerie's name, he can never retract them. I leaned back in the black leather chair, mirroring Miranda's composed posture. We will not just reject his bid, Miranda. We will let him meticulously construct his own gallows, tie the knot himself, and step onto the trapdoor in front of his entire financial syndicate. Then I will pull the lever. Miranda Cole did not hesitate. She reached out and pulled the manila folder back across the table. She closed the cover, her perfectly manicured hand resting heavily on top of the cardboard. The heavy, oppressive silence of the boardroom felt less like a corporate meeting space and more like a war room moments before the final, devastating artillery strike was ordered. Miranda handed me the formal complaint, her eyes gleaming with a predatory calm as we finalized the blueprint for his highly public execution. My father walked into the boardroom with the swagger of a conquering king, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was stepping directly onto a trapdoor. It was exactly 9 a.m. on Monday. The 50th floor boardroom of Vanguard Municipal Holdings was a sprawling, sterile theater of polished concrete, brushed steel, and heavy frosted glass. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the gray, churning waters of the industrial harbor rolled under a heavy overcast sky. I sat in the high-backed black leather chair to the immediate right of Miranda Cole. 6 elite members of the Vanguard Executive Board, men and women wearing sharp bespoke suits and carrying heavily encrypted digital tablets, flanked the remainder of our side of the massive conference table. I wore my dark, freshly pressed consignment blazer. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. I did not check my watch, and I did not adjust my collar. I simply watched the heavy glass doors at the far end of the room. When the metallic latch finally clicked open, William Stanford led his entourage into the room with the aggressive, territorial momentum of a predator claiming a new hunting ground. He wore a pristine charcoal pinstripe suit, his heavy gold watch flashing under the recessed overhead lighting. Flanking him were 2 ruthless corporate lawyers carrying thick, locking leather briefcases. Directly behind the legal muscle walked Valerie. She was draped in a tailored crimson designer suit, her expensive heels clicking a sharp, arrogant rhythm against the polished marble floor. Cradled securely in her arms was the massive, heavy black leather binder bearing the gold-embossed seal of Stanford and Associates. She carried my grandfather's stolen legacy as if it were her own absolute birthright. Trailing at the very rear of the formation was my mother, Evelyn. She wore a high-collared cream silk blouse and her signature strand of perfect, heavy pearls. Her posture was rigidly straight, but her eyes immediately darted to the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. She looked exactly like a woman actively pretending not to smell smoke in a burning building. William marched directly toward the opposite side of the concrete table. As he approached his designated seat, his eyes locked onto my face. A microscopic stutter disrupted his confident stride. The thick muscles in his jaw locked. He had fully expected to find me seated in a folding chair in the corner of the room, flanked by armed lobby security, trembling under the weight of his formal ethics complaint. Finding me seated securely at the right hand of the Vanguard chief executive officer deeply unsettled his rigid worldview. However, a cornered narcissist relies entirely on manufactured reality. Within 2 seconds, he actively suppressed his confusion. His arrogant posture returned in full force. He rationalized my placement, assuming Miranda Cole had simply brought the accused low-level clerk to the center of the table to face her imminent, humiliating termination head-on. Valerie sat down directly across from me. She slid the heavy black binder onto the concrete, carefully aligning the edges with the table. She looked at my faded lapels, slowly crossed her legs, and let a slow, malicious smirk spread across her perfectly manicured face. Evelyn took the seat furthest away from the center, folding her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles turning white. Miranda Cole leaned forward. She did not smile. She tapped a heavy silver pen against her digital tablet, calling the room to order. "We are convened this morning to formally address a priority ethics grievance filed by Stanford and Associates," Miranda stated, her voice a low, commanding rumble that echoed off the glass walls. "William, you have demanded a formal tribunal regarding the integrity of our internal evaluation department and the security of your municipal waterfront bid. Vanguard takes all allegations of corporate espionage with absolute seriousness. The floor is yours." William stood up. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, projecting an air of deep, patriarchal sorrow. He rested his heavy palms on the edge of the polished concrete, leaning forward slightly to cast his shadow over the Vanguard executives. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Miranda, initiating a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. "Miranda, members of the board, I want to personally thank you for convening this tribunal," William began, his voice dripping with a thick, artificial honey. He pressed his right hand against his chest, directly over his heart. "It brings me profound, immeasurable pain to stand before you today and discuss my own flesh and blood. A father is supposed to protect his children, but when a child becomes a toxic liability to the commercial integrity of our great city, I must choose professional duty over blind familial loyalty." He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his manufactured grief. One of his corporate lawyers smoothly unlatched his briefcase and slid a stack of legal affidavits across the table. "4 years ago," William continued, dropping his tone into a grave, serious register, "I entrusted my eldest daughter, Josephine, with a corporate credit card. It was intended strictly for emergency graduate school expenses. Instead, she maliciously embezzled exactly $4,000 from my firm's operating accounts to fund a chaotic, highly erratic, and unsupervised lifestyle. When I confronted her with the undeniable financial proof, she did not apologize. She flew into a violent, unhinged rage, abandoned her family, and vanished into the underbelly of this city." Valerie subtly shook her head, adopting a perfectly rehearsed expression of sisterly disappointment. Evelyn adjusted her heavy pearls, keeping her eyes glued entirely to the polished concrete. "We tried to save her." William lied seamlessly, his face an absolute mask of earnest conviction. "My wife and I offered her rehabilitation. We offered to forgive the massive financial debt. We pleaded with her to return to the safety of our estate, but Josephine harbors a deep, bitter resentment toward success. She fundamentally despises the legacy I have built. William stepped away from his chair, pacing slowly behind his seated legal team. He gestured broadly toward Valerie. My youngest daughter, Valerie, is an architectural prodigy, he declared, his voice swelling with manufactured pride. She possesses a structural vision that comes along once in a generation. She spent the last calendar year meticulously drafting a revolutionary cantilevered municipal plaza for your Vanguard waterfront initiative. It is, without question, the pinnacle of modern sustainable development. He stopped pacing. He turned his head and finally locked his eyes directly onto my face. He pointed a thick, heavy finger straight at my chest. And because Josephine cannot tolerate her younger sister's brilliant ascent, she tracked my firm. She discovered we were submitting this masterpiece to Vanguard. William spat, his voice hardening into a sharp, venomous accusation. She manipulated her way into your building as a low-level evaluation clerk. She is sitting at this table right now with one singular, vindictive goal to illegally sabotage my daughter's flawless blueprints and destroy my firm's immaculate reputation. The Vanguard board members remained entirely stoic. They did not gasp. They did not whisper among themselves. They continued typing silently on their encrypted tablets, their faces carved from stone. I did not flinch. I did not open my mouth to shout a desperate defense. I did not grip the edges of the table or show a single fracture of emotional distress. I maintained perfect, terrifying eye contact with my father, my face completely devoid of any human reaction. My suffocating silence functioned like fuel on his raging fire, mistaking the board's absolute quiet for total agreement. William moved in for the final kill. Vanguard cannot afford to harbor an unstable, vindictive thief, William demanded, planting his knuckles hard against the table. I formally require this board to immediately terminate her employment, strike her unauthorized access from your security grid, and physically escort her from this building. Furthermore, because her presence has fundamentally compromised the preliminary evaluation phase, I demand that Stanford and Associates be instantly granted the $15 million municipal advance, bypassing all further structural review. He stood tall, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, definitive snap. He believed he had just checkmated the entire room. He thought his aggressive, highly rehearsed narrative of the tragic, benevolent father and the brilliant, victimized prodigy had completely neutralized my existence. I sat perfectly still beside Miranda Cole, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of my grandfather's tarnished brass key resting deep inside my blazer pocket. I let him spin his web of lies for 20 uninterrupted minutes, allowing his suffocating arrogance to inflate to its absolute, fatal maximum. The smug, self-satisfied smirk melted off my father's face the exact second the digital projector illuminated the room. He had just taken his seat, settling into the high-backed black leather chair with the heavy, unearned satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully executed a flawless deception. Valerie had triumphantly opened her massive black binder, pushing the glossy, three-dimensional rendering of the municipal plaza toward the center of the table. They waited for the Vanguard executives to applaud. They waited for Miranda Cole to summon lobby security and have me dragged out of the building. Instead, Miranda calmly reached across her polished concrete console and pressed a single silver button. The heavy, soundproof blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows whirred softly, angling downward to block out the gray harbor light. A massive, high-definition projection screen descended seamlessly from the ceiling, locking into place directly behind Miranda's chair. A hidden lens embedded in the table flared to life, casting a brilliant, blinding white rectangle across the darkened room. Two highly detailed architectural images appeared side by side on the massive screen. On the right side of the projection was Valerie's submission. The glossy, highly modernized rendering showcased the sprawling, multi-tiered pedestrian plaza with its distinct, asymmetrical, cantilevered pavilion roof. It was the exact image she had flaunted on her social media feed. the exact design William was currently attempting to leverage for a $15 million municipal advance. On the left side of the projection was a high-resolution scanned image of heavily aged, yellowing parchment. The drawing was not rendered by a sterile computer program. It was meticulously drafted by human hands using sharp graphite, heavy rulers, and a brass compass. The angles of the stepped concrete terraces were absolutely identical. The distinct asymmetrical slope of the cantilevered roofline was mathematically indistinguishable. The only difference was the origin. At the bottom right corner of the aged parchment, written in bold, unmistakable architectural script, was the date 1998. Directly beside the date was the original signature, Thomas Stanford. The absolute suffocating silence in the boardroom fractured. The 6 Vanguard executives stopped typing on their encrypted digital tablets simultaneously. One man at the far end of the table slowly removed his silver-rimmed glasses, leaning forward until his chest nearly touched the cold concrete. Another executive picked up Valerie's glossy submission, holding it up to the light of the projector, his eyes darting rapidly between the physical page and the 1998 blueprint. William stared at the massive screen, his chest completely freezing in the middle of a heavy breath. He recognized his father's sharp, undeniable drafting strokes immediately, the healthy, confident flush of color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His jaw slackened. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Miranda Cole with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "William," Miranda stated, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a steel scalpel, "you just stood in my boardroom and explicitly claimed your daughter spent the last calendar year drafting this revolutionary structural masterpiece. Yet, Vanguard archival records indicate this exact municipal plaza was originally engineered 28 years ago by Thomas Stanford." William opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to his right. His 2 highly paid corporate lawyers did not leap to his defense. They leaned back in their chairs. One of the men quietly reached down, snapped the golden latches of his heavy leather briefcase shut, and physically shifted his chair away from William, actively distancing himself from the epicenter of a massive, heavily documented federal fraud trap. I did not wait for my father to recover his breath. I reached down into my worn canvas messenger bag. My fingers brushed past my dark wool sweater and closed tightly around the cracked spine of the black leather-bound ledger. I pulled the heavy book from the bag and placed it squarely on the polished concrete table, the distinct scent of cedar shavings and ancient. Undisturbed paper wafted into the sterile, air-conditioned room. I placed my hand flat against the heavy leather cover and pushed. The ledger slid smoothly across the long table, the friction creating a low, sustained scraping sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. It stopped exactly 1 inch from the fingertips of the lead Vanguard evaluation executive. "That ledger contains over 2 decades of meticulously documented intellectual theft," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing with absolute clinical detachment. "Inside, you will find original graphite sketches, foundational load-bearing calculations, and preliminary municipal drafts belonging entirely to Thomas Stanford. On the corresponding pages, you will find the corporate press releases from Stanford and Associates, demonstrating a continuous, unbroken pattern of William Stanford erasing the original title blocks and fraudulently claiming the architectural patents as his own." The lead executive opened the heavy cover. He slowly turned the thick pages, his eyes scanning the attached newspaper clippings from 1996 and 1989. He examined the stolen cascading water features, the purloined municipal courthouses, and the hijacked retaining walls. He passed the heavy ledger to the woman seated beside him, the undeniable, physical evidence of my father's hollow. Parasitic career was laid completely bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. Evelyn pressed her back firmly against her chair, her manicured hands trembling violently in her lap. She looked at William, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. The impenetrable luxury fortress she had traded her eldest daughter to secure was built entirely on a rotting foundation of lies, and the walls were currently collapsing directly on top of her. William slammed his hands flat against the table, desperately trying to salvage his disintegrating reality. "This is an absolute outrage," William shouted, his voice cracking, spit flying from his lips. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger at me. "She forged that book. She is a vindictive, unstable thief trying to ruin her sister's legitimate career. The plaza design is a family asset, a collaborative inspiration, and Valerie modernized the entire structural matrix to fit modern municipal codes." Miranda Cole did not raise her voice. She simply turned her head and looked at the severe Vanguard executive seated to her left. The executive, a man wearing a tailored navy suit, did not look at William. He picked up his heavy silver pen, tapped it once against his digital tablet, and locked his cold eyes directly onto Valerie. "Ms. Stanford," the executive began, his tone strictly professional, entirely stripping away the manufactured prestige of her crimson designer suit. "Since you are the sole signatory on this architectural submission, and you personally claim to have modernized the structural matrix, I require a basic verbal confirmation of your engineering methodology." Valerie stiffened. Her manufactured, arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by the wide, panicked stare of a deer caught in the headlights of a massive, accelerating freight train. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "In your submitted blueprint," the executive continued, reading directly from the digital scan of her application, "you reduced the depth of the foundational concrete anchors by exactly 50% compared to the original 1998 schematic. Furthermore, you completely eliminated the subterranean steel counterweights. The proposed geographic location for this project sits directly in a highly corrosive coastal wind shear zone." He set his pen down, folding his hands precisely over his tablet. "Please explain the specific mathematical formula you utilize to ensure your unsupported cantilevered pavilion roof will not catastrophically collapse under the extreme atmospheric pressure of a Category 4 storm surge." It was a fundamental, entry-level question regarding load-bearing physics. Anyone who had actually spent a calendar year drafting a massive municipal structure would have the specific tension ratios and weight distribution formulas permanently branded into the front of their mind. Valerie froze. Her jaw trembled. She opened her mouth, but the complex architectural terminology she needed to construct a convincing lie simply did not exist in her brain. She looked desperately to her right, her eyes pleading with William to intervene, to shield her from the brutal, unyielding reality of the concrete table. William immediately lunged forward, his face burning a mottled, furious red. "My daughter does not need to answer to this blatant interrogation." "Mr. Stanford, you will remain entirely silent," Miranda Cole snapped, her voice cracking like a heavy leather whip. "Your daughter is listed as the lead structural architect on a municipal bid requesting $15 million in federal funding. She will answer the question right now, or I will immediately call the federal authorities and have you both detained in this lobby for explicit wire fraud." William clamped his mouth shut, his chest heaving, his massive ego instantly crushed by the absolute threat of federal prison. He sank back into his chair, powerless to stop the execution. The executive kept his unblinking gaze fixed entirely on Valerie. "The mathematical formula. Ms. Stanford, how does the structure stand up?" Valerie looked back at the Vanguard board. Her lower lip quivered violently. The heavy, suffocating pressure of the boardroom crushed her fragile, heavily subsidized ego into fine dust. A thick tear rolled down her cheek, cutting a dark path through her expensive makeup. She gripped the edges of her crimson blazer, her perfectly manicured nails digging helplessly into the fabric. Valerie stuttered into a pathetic, weeping silence, her false genius permanently vaporized by a single question about load-bearing physics she could not answer. Desperation stripped away my father's bespoke armor, leaving only a frantic, hyperventilating fraud grasping blindly at straws. Valerie's pathetic, sobbing breakdown echoed loudly against the cold glass walls of the Vanguard boardroom. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her crimson designer suit heavily wrinkled as she slumped forward over the polished concrete table. She had been publicly, surgically exposed by a fundamental load-bearing equation she could not comprehend. Her tears were not born of genuine remorse. They were the bitter, humiliating tears of a spoiled child whose unearned pedestal had just been violently kicked out from under her. William did not reach out to comfort his weeping daughter. He did not place a reassuring hand on her shoulder or attempt to shield her from the piercing, judgmental stares of the Vanguard executive board. Instead, his thick jaw locked with absolute revulsion. He violently shoved her heavy black leather binder aside, treating her highly manufactured genius like discarded trash. He needed a new weapon, and he needed it immediately. He stood up entirely, his chair scraping harshly against the polished marble floor. A thick, greasy sheen of sweat completely coated his flushed forehead. He unbuttoned his collar, loosening his expensive silk tie as if the air in the massive, climate-controlled room had suddenly been sucked into a vacuum. "The structural blueprints are entirely irrelevant," William barked, his voice abandoning its manufactured, patriarchal smoothness, fracturing into a hoarse, aggressive bark. He slapped his heavy palm flat against the concrete table, leaning his entire body weight forward. "You can reject this architectural bid. You can hire whatever firm you want to redesign the cantilevered roof, but you still cannot build a single square foot of this waterfront park without my explicit permission. Miranda." The Vanguard executives paused. The lead evaluator, the man who had just dismantled Valerie's non-existent physics, slowly lowered his digital tablet. William seized the momentary hesitation, his chest puffing out as he clung desperately to his final, massive piece of corporate leverage. He was a ruthless commercial developer, and he knew how to play the brutal game of municipal monopoly. "I anticipated the complexities of this coastal development initiative," William sneered, a frantic, ugly confidence returning to his bloodshot eyes. 2 years ago, I systematically purchased the remaining 60 acres of derelict commercial real estate directly bordering the Vanguard Harbor Zone. I own the staging grounds. I own the primary highway access points. If you attempt to bring heavy excavation equipment or pour a single yard of concrete on that coastline without partnering with Stanford and Associates, I will lock you out. He began pacing again, his heavy leather shoes striking the floor with aggressive, territorial authority. He pointed a thick finger directly at Miranda Cole. "If you deny my $15 million advance today, I will file endless municipal zoning injunctions," William threatened, his voice echoing loudly across the boardroom. "I will trap Vanguard in appellate litigation for the next 10 years. I will bleed your corporate development fund completely dry before you even break ground. You need my commercial land. Miranda, you have absolutely no choice but to fund my firm." He stopped pacing and crossed his arms over his chest, heavily inhaling the stale air. He believed he had successfully pivoted the trap, transforming a humiliating exposure of federal fraud into a brutal, non-negotiable real estate extortion. He assumed the sheer financial threat of a decade-long legal stalemate would force Vanguard to capitulate and quietly write his check. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed black leather chair beside Miranda Cole. I did not blink. I did not react to his aggressive posturing or the sheer volume of his desperate threats. I slowly uncrossed my ankles, planting my scuffed black work shoes firmly against the floor. I reached back into my worn canvas messenger bag. My fingers bypassed my dark wool sweater and the black leather-bound evidence ledger. I felt the heavy, thick texture of legal-sized parchment bound tightly by a dark blue silk ribbon. I pulled the thick stack of documents from the bag and placed them squarely onto the polished concrete table. The room went instantly, terrifyingly quiet. The sound of the heavy parchment striking the cold surface snapped William's attention directly toward my hands. His frantic, arrogant sneer faltered, replaced by a sudden, creeping dread. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I smoothly untied the dark blue silk ribbon, letting it fall away, and spread the heavy, deeply embossed municipal land deeds completely across the center of the table. The metallic seals of the city clerk's office caught the bright light of the digital projector. "You own 60 acres of derelict commercial real estate directly bordering the harbor," I stated, my voice a low, clinical absolute that cut straight through the frantic energy he had just expelled. "You purchased the vast open acreage under the assumption that controlling the surface area granted you total geographic dominance. But my grandfather understood that true structural authority does not lie in the visible acreage. It lies in the subterranean veins." I reached forward and slid the primary municipal deed exactly 3 inches toward his side of the table. "Examine the geographic coordinates, William," I instructed, my tone entirely devoid of any familial warmth. "Read the specific lot numbers stamped by the city clerk." William stared at the heavy parchment. He did not step forward to pick it up. His eyes tracked the bold, black ink traversing the page, reading the heavily restricted municipal coordinates. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his heavily flushed skin a sickly, pale gray. His chest stopped heaving, completely freezing under his tailored suit. "Those are not sweeping acres of commercial development land," I explained, tracing the path of the coordinates with my index finger against the concrete. "Those are highly specific, microscopic utility parcels and foundational access roads. They map directly to the subterranean water mains, the municipal power grid connectors, and the only structural retaining wall capable of supporting heavy excavation equipment along the Vanguard harbor." I pulled the final legal transfer document from the stack and placed it directly on top of the original deed. 30 years ago, Thomas Stanford legally subdivided those critical utility arteries from the main commercial acreage. I continued, my voice echoing like a final, definitive gavel strike in the silent boardroom. "He registered them to an irrevocable blind trust. The sole beneficiary listed on the finalized transfer documents is Josephine Stanford. I own the bottleneck." William's hands began to shake. The heavy gold watch on his wrist rattled slightly against his cuff. He gripped the edge of the polished concrete table, his knuckles turning stark white as his entire lower body threatened to give out. "Your 60 acres of commercial land are completely and permanently landlocked," I stated, delivering the final, fatal mathematical equation of his ruin. "You cannot bring heavy equipment onto your property without trespassing on my access roads. You cannot tap into the municipal water mains without boring directly through my legally protected subterranean parcels. You cannot build a single structure on your land, and you cannot sell it to any other developer. Because without my explicit legal permission, your 60 acres of dirt are fundamentally and absolutely worthless." The Vanguard executives watched him in absolute silence. His highly paid corporate lawyers did not attempt to argue the legality of the deeply embossed deeds. They recognized an ironclad, unassailable legal chokehold when they saw one. The full, devastating reality of his financial architecture finally collapsed inward, crushing the air completely out of his lungs. William was carrying 18% interest bridge loans just to keep the lights on at his downtown firm. He had cross-collateralized his sprawling, $12 million luxury estate against the Vanguard bid, utilizing the 60 acres of commercial land as his primary asset of leverage. Now, that primary asset was dead. It was entirely useless. Without the Vanguard $15 million advance, he could not make his monthly interest payments. The regional banking syndicate would immediately trigger a massive corporate default. Within 48 hours, the banks would freeze his operating accounts, lock the doors to his firm, and initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on the family estate. Evelyn, sitting silently at the far end of the table, covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. The pristine, untouchable luxury life she had viciously guarded by sacrificing her eldest daughter was evaporating right in front of her eyes. William's thick jaw trembled. He looked at the heavy parchment deeds, then slowly raised his eyes to meet my gaze. He searched my face for a single ounce of pity, a shred of the desperate, validation-seeking child he had tried to starve into submission 4 years ago. He found absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of cold, impenetrable stone. I did not smile, and I did not flinch. I was a mirror reflecting his total, unavoidable destruction. As he stared at the embossed municipal deed bearing my name, The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. I owned the oxygen to his sinking ship, and I was cutting the line. The absolute destruction of the Stanford legacy did not happen with a violent explosion, but with the quiet, cowardly clicking of briefcases snapping shut. William Stanford stared at the heavily embossed municipal deeds resting on the polished concrete table, the bold, black ink outlining the microscopic utility parcels and subterranean water mains burned directly into his retinas. The absolute certainty of his geographic chokehold fundamentally shattered his physical composure. His thick knees, completely unable to support the sudden, crushing weight of his catastrophic financial reality, simply gave out beneath his tailored charcoal suit. He fell heavily backward into the high-backed black leather chair. The violent impact forced a sharp, ragged wheeze from his lungs. His massive hands instantly flew upward, clutching violently at his chest. His thick fingers ground the expensive silk of his tie against his sternum. The aggressive, territorial flush that had painted his face a mottled red entirely evaporated in a matter of seconds, replaced by a terrifying, sickly shade of pale ash. A thick, greasy sheen of cold sweat erupted across his forehead, gathering in the deep creases around his eyes and rolling steadily down his jawline. His breath began to rattle deep within his throat, producing a wet, shallow, and desperate sound that echoed unnervingly across the sterile, climate-controlled boardroom. To his immediate right, the two highly paid corporate attorneys did not flinch. They did not lean over to check his pulse, loosen his collar, or offer a glass of water. They operated strictly on pure, predatory survival instinct. They looked up at the massive projection screen illuminating the original 1998 architectural blueprint. They looked down at the black leather ledger, detailing over 2 decades of systemic intellectual theft. Finally, their eyes scanned the red-bordered federal compliance forms exposing the toxic 18% bridge loans and the heavily cross-collateralized $12 million estate. They understood the exact trajectory of the incoming devastation. Federal auditors would swarm the downtown offices of Stanford and Associates before the sun set. They stood up in absolute, synchronized silence. They did not look at William. They smoothly gathered their legal affidavits, slid them back into their thick leather bags, and snapped the heavy golden latches securely shut. The sharp metallic click sliced directly through William's ragged wheezing. Without uttering a single syllable of defense, without offering their client a final piece of counsel, the two men turned on their heels and marched briskly out of the heavy glass doors. Their swift exit instantly severed their legal complicity and abandoned him completely to the federal guillotine. William gasped, his eyes darting frantically toward the far end of the long concrete table. He desperately sought the one remaining pillar of his manufactured empire. Evelyn Stanford sat perfectly rigid in her black leather chair. Her eyes tracked the retreating lawyers, then slowly shifted to the sweating, wheezing mass of her husband. Her mind, an intricate mechanism forever calculating the exact trajectory of absolute comfort, rapidly processed the new, horrifying reality of her existence. The $15 million municipal advance was completely gone. The sprawling luxury estate she worshipped was actively plunging into immediate foreclosure. The imported luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, and the pristine, untouchable social status she had meticulously cultivated for decades were currently burning to ash right in front of her face. She looked at William, a man struggling violently to pull oxygen into his lungs under the crushing weight of his own hubris. Her face remained an impenetrable, flawless mask of polished porcelain. She did not gasp in horror. She did not rush to his side to hold his hand or offer a single word of wifely devotion. 4 years ago, she had coldly commanded her eldest daughter to surrender her dignity, demanding I absorb William's extortion simply to protect her affluent lifestyle. Now, stripped of that wealth, Evelyn applied that exact same transactional ruthlessness directly to her husband. She slowly reached out and picked up her imported designer handbag from the concrete table. She placed it securely over her forearm with a slow, deliberate motion. She adjusted the heavy strand of perfect pearls resting flush against her cream silk blouse, ensuring they sat perfectly centered against her collarbone. She stood up, her expensive heels scraping softly against the polished marble floor. William reached out. He extended a trembling, sweating hand toward her across the long table. His thick fingers curled inward, a pathetic, silent plea for a shred of human support. Evelyn stopped. She looked directly at his shaking, desperate hand. She did not reach out to meet it. She simply lowered her chin, turned her back entirely, and walked steadily toward the heavy glass doors. Her posture remained rigidly straight, her silk blouse catching the harsh fluorescent light, prioritizing her exit over his survival. She walked out of the boardroom without looking back, completely severing her ties to a sinking ship that could no longer fund her vanity. Valerie, her face severely streaked with ruined, dark makeup, ceased her pathetic, stuttering, weeping, the realization that her golden pedestal had vanished, leaving her completely exposed to federal engineering fraud, left her entirely hollow. She looked at her wheezing father, then stared blankly at the heavy black binder containing her fraudulent signature. She scrambled frantically out of her chair. Her crimson designer suit was severely wrinkled, her manufactured arrogance completely erased. She hurried quickly after her mother, her expensive heels clicking rapidly in a desperate retreat, leaving my grandfather's stolen legacy abandoned on the table. William was entirely alone. He slumped heavily in his chair, his chin dropping toward his chest, his breath tearing through his dry throat in desperate, uneven gasps. Miranda Cole did not offer him a single moment of respite. She tapped her heavy silver pen sharply against her encrypted digital tablet, calling the attention of her silent, observing executive board. "William," Miranda stated, her voice a low, unyielding absolute that offered zero pity. "Vanguard Municipal Holdings officially and permanently rejects your architectural submission for the Municipal Waterfront Park Project." She turned her head, addressing the lead evaluation executive seated to her left. "Forward this entire comprehensive dossier directly to the Federal Municipal Oversight Committee," Miranda commanded, her tone strictly procedural. "Include the original 1998 blueprints, the ledger of intellectual theft, and the fraudulent structural load calculations submitted today under Valerie's signature. Furthermore, notify the regional banking syndicate that his bid has been formally denied, and forward them the evidence of his toxic cross-collateralization. This tribunal is officially concluded." The lead executive nodded once, his fingers flying rapidly across his tablet to execute the final, lethal administrative strike. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not lean across the cold concrete table to hurl insults or scream vindictive curses at the broken, wheezing man who had once tried to starve me into submission. I did not demand an apology for the freezing nights spent scrubbing diner floors or the excruciating pain in my blistered heels. Gloating requires an emotional investment, and I had absolutely none left to give him. I calmly reached forward. My movements were slow, clinical, and precise. I gathered the heavy, deeply embossed municipal deeds bearing my irrevocable trust. I folded the dark blue silk ribbon around the thick parchment, tying a secure knot, and placed the documents safely into my worn canvas messenger bag. I reached out and picked up the black leather-bound ledger, feeling the undeniable, profound weight of my grandfather's absolute vindication resting heavily against my palms. I slid the book securely beside the deeds. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my dark, freshly pressed consignment blazer, checking my reflection briefly in the dark surface of the blank projector screen. I looked down at William Stanford. His heavy hands rested limply on his thighs. His eyes were wide, vacant, and completely defeated, staring blankly at the empty space where his massive empire had just stood minutes prior. He was completely stripped of his wealth, his enablers, and his manufactured genius. He was exactly what he had always been beneath the expensive. Tailored suits a hollow, parasitic fraud incapable of surviving under his own power. I walked out of the glass boardroom without looking back, leaving the hollow shell of my father to drown in the shallow puddle of his own making. The crisp autumn breeze sweeping off the newly constructed waterfront carried the scent of fresh pine and absolute freedom. Exactly 6 months had passed since the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Municipal Holdings boardroom closed behind me. The ensuing collapse of Stanford and Associates was not a slow, dignified decline. It was a rapid, catastrophic implosion engineered entirely by my father's massive hubris. Within 48 hours of Miranda Cole rejecting his fraudulent municipal bid, the regional banking syndicate formally recalled his 18% interest bridge loans. The massive, toxic debt he had cross-collateralized against his $12 million luxury estate triggered an immediate, irrevocable default. Federal engineering auditors swarmed his downtown architectural offices before the end of the week. They confiscated the secure servers, sealed the heavy filing cabinets, and matched the contents of my grandfather's cedar ledger directly to my father's extensive, highly documented history of federal wire fraud. The commercial real estate elite of the city, the powerful developers and wealthy contractors who had once attended his lavish holiday parties, instantly severed all ties to avoid federal complicity. Today, William Stanford does not wear bespoke charcoal pinstripe suits. He does not wear a heavy gold watch or command high-end boardrooms. He wears a stiff, brightly colored polyester uniform vest that awkwardly constricts his broad shoulders. The heavy steel-toed boots blister his heels, a poetic echo of the physical pain I endured during my 4 years scrubbing the floors of that 24-hour diner. He works a grueling minimum wage job, strictly assigned to stocking 50-pound bags of landscape fertilizer and abrasive sacks of dry concrete mix. He spends his days slowly pushing squeaking flatbed carts through the poorly lit concrete aisles of a big-box retail hardware store on the distant industrial outskirts of the city. He is heavily ostracized by the commercial elite. When former colleagues or wealthy contractors occasionally wander down his aisle, they actively look away, pretending not to recognize the sweating, broken ghost of the man who once aggressively commanded their industry. Valerie's precipitous fall was equally absolute, stripped of the protective, wealthy bubble her father had meticulously maintained. Her manufactured genius violently evaporated in the harsh, unforgiving sunlight of reality. The federal investigation completely exposed her direct signature on the fraudulent structural load calculations, permanently cementing her name to a massive federal crime. She was officially stripped of her professional architectural license before she even had a chance to legally practice, facing massive legal fees from the federal prosecutors and total, unmitigated bankruptcy. She was aggressively evicted from her luxury downtown loft by armed municipal sheriffs. No reputable firm in the state will grant her an interview, not even for a basic administrative role. She spends her days sitting alone in cheap coffee shops, furiously scrolling through the social media feeds of real, successful architects permanently trapped in a hollow, bitter irrelevance. She is completely ignored, a counterfeit prodigy whose entire identity was built on a stolen foundation. Evelyn did not fare any better when the banking syndicate foreclosed on the sprawling estate, the imported luxury vehicles, the designer furniture, and the exclusive country club memberships were immediately auctioned off to satisfy the massive commercial liens. Evelyn, having actively refused to acquire a single marketable skill in over 3 decades, was forced into exile. The walls of her tiny, damp, ground-floor apartment are heavily stained with persistent water damage, and the rusted radiators emit only a weak, rattling hiss during the freezing nights. She has no domestic staff. She has no social calendar. She spends her evenings sitting in a worn, second-hand armchair near a drafty window, staring blankly at the cracked asphalt of a decaying parking lot. She tightly clutches her signature strand of heavy pearls, the singular, pathetic remnant of the untouchable luxury she had so viciously sacrificed her eldest daughter to protect. She lives in total, suffocating silence, completely abandoned by the husband she deserted in the Vanguard boardroom. I did not attend their bankruptcy hearings. I did not drive past the industrial hardware store to gloat at my father's minimum wage reality. Nor did I search for Valerie's deactivated social media accounts. Gloating is a mechanism for the deeply insecure, and my vengeance was already mathematically complete. Instead, I stood in the bright, crisp sunlight, looking up at the sprawling, magnificent Vanguard waterfront park. The massive, asymmetrical cantilevered pavilion roof stretched flawlessly over the public plaza, a breathtaking testament to structural physics and sustainable engineering. The deep foundational anchors and subterranean steel counterweights, the exact mathematical components Valerie had foolishly attempted to erase, were securely embedded deep into the coastal bedrock. The park was heavily populated with families, laughing children, and city residents enjoying the sprawling green spaces and cascading water features. It was perfectly engineered. It was exactly as Thomas Stanford had drafted it in 1998. Miranda Cole stood to my right, wearing a sharp silver blazer, holding a pair of heavy ceremonial scissors. She smiled warmly, stepping back to allow me to stand directly at the center of the broad silk ribbon spanning the main entrance. I was no longer an invisible clerk or an estranged daughter freezing in a damp diner. I was the lead municipal developer for Vanguard, commanding a massive federal budget and a dedicated team of 50 brilliant architects. As I grasped the heavy scissors and sliced cleanly through the ribbon to the thunderous applause of the assembled city officials, I felt the undeniable weight of my grandfather's tarnished brass key resting securely in my pocket. I had not just salvaged his intellectual property, I had permanently enshrined his true legacy into the geographic heart of the city. Enduring toxic, narcissistic abuse is a profound trauma, but it is never a mandatory life sentence. The arrogant and the greedy rely on volume, manipulation, and the deliberate erosion of your self-worth to maintain their fragile control. They desperately need you to believe that without their absolute approval, without their manufactured umbrellas, you will drown in the rain. But setting absolute, non-negotiable boundaries and walking away in total silence is the ultimate. Undeniable power. True worth is never proven through frantic, emotional screaming or desperate pleas for validation. True worth is proven through meticulous, undeniable action. It is built quietly in the dark, forged through unbreakable resilience, and eventually revealed in the blinding light of reality, leaving those who tried to destroy you to choke entirely on the dust of your ascent. I folded the ceremonial ribbon, taking one final, deep breath of the fresh pine air, completely unburdened and entirely free. Thank you for joining me on this journey of claiming true worth. Please share your story of walking away from a toxic environment to build your own success in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment.